The dead lie in a curve of ancient sand beside the Nile, their bones carrying a story that no one wrote down. For thousands of years, the river moves past them, as if nothing happened. Water rises, mud settles, grass withers, kingdoms appear far to the north and vanish again, and still the bodies remain where they are placed or dropped, marked by stone blades, fractured skulls, and the small, brutal mathematics of impact. Some are men, some are women, some are children. Some seem to have been struck more than once. In a few tiny points of worked stone are still found lodged in bone, as intimate and as undeniable as fingerprints. Seen from far away, it looks like silence. Seen up close, it looks like an argument that has lasted 10,000 years. Did humans begin war here, on a dusty frontier, where hungry groups collided along a shrinking river? Or is this only one surviving fragment of something much older, a late echo of conflicts that vanished without trace because wood rotted, flesh disappeared, and the places where the dead fell were swallowed by weather and time? Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The difficulty begins with the word itself. War feels like one of those things everyone should recognize on sight. A battlefield, a weapon, a shattered wall, a grave full of violent death. Yet, the farther back in time one goes, the less obvious it becomes. A broken skull is not automatically war. A buried spear point is not automatically war. One body with wounds may be murder, feud, execution, accident, or ritual. 10 bodies may still be something other than war. Even a massacre, terrible as it is, does not necessarily prove the sustained conflict of one group against another over time. The evidence remains incomplete, and the deeper prehistory becomes, the more every neat category begins to fray. What survives in the record suggests that humans have always been capable of violence. That much is beyond doubt. But the moment violence becomes war, organized, repeated, collective, remembered, planned, that is far harder to pin down. And yet the question refuses to go away, partly because it is really several questions wearing the same face. Did the first humans fight? Certainly. Did families and bands kill rivals? Almost certainly. Did groups ambush one another over territory, water, mates, prestige, revenge, or fear? Very likely. But when did conflict become something larger than a killing? When did it become a pattern, an institution, a grim social habit? When did people begin to expect attack, prepare for it, train for it, bury their dead in its shadow, shape their settlements around it, and pass its memory to the next generation? That is where the mystery thickens. Because now the subject is not anger or cruelty alone. It is structure. It is repetition. It is the emergence of a human possibility so consequential that in later ages entire civilizations will orient themselves around it. The temptation is to imagine war arriving fully formed, with banners, ranks, commanders, and reasons grand enough to be carved into monuments. But the oldest violence has no monument. It leaves only fragments. A healed fracture on an arm that may have been raised to block a blow. A cluster of arrow injuries on several bodies in one place. A settlement ringed by ditch and timber. A landscape where villages burn and are rebuilt. The first war, if that phrase can even be used, probably does not announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in at the edge of survival, identity, and memory. It may begin with one raid answered by another, one theft made unforgivable, one boundary crossed too many times. It may arise in hunger. It may arise in abundance. Scholars still debate whether war becomes more common when resources are scarce or when they are worth defending. And no single explanation fully accounts for the breadth of human conflict. The truth may be more unsettling than either extreme. Humans do not need one reason to fight. They need only a world in which reasons can accumulate. For most of human existence, there are no states, no tax systems, no written laws, no professional armies, no kings claiming land by decree. There are only people bound by kinship, memory, and necessity, moving through environments that can be generous one year and merciless the next. It is easy from the modern world to place war inside civilization, as if bureaucracy invented it. Certainly, civilization magnifies war. It records it, glorifies it, finances it, industrializes it, and extends it across distances that would once have been unimaginable. But magnification is not invention. Long before walls of stone and tablets of clay, humans know fear, loyalty, suspicion, and loss. They know the importance of a water source in a dry season. They know what it means for game to vanish from a hunting range. They know that strangers can be a source of exchange and marriage, or a source of danger. The line between those possibilities is thin. Sometimes it is invisible until it is crossed. That is part of what makes the first evidence so eerie. Ancient violent death is often encountered not as narrative, but as interruption. Archaeologists open a burial and find one skull marked by trauma, then another, then another. They uncover a trench where bodies lie in awkward positions, or a cemetery where wounds repeat with uncomfortable consistency. A person dies with a projectile point in the pelvis. Another shows cut marks, consistent with close assault. Another survives one attack only to die in a later one, the bones recording both injury and endurance. These remains do not tell us names, motives, or speeches given before dawn. They tell us something at once smaller and more powerful. This happened to a body, then it happened again, then again. And somewhere behind those repeated injuries lies a social reality that bones can only hint at. The oldest chapters of that reality may stretch back farther than the famous sites that usually dominate the conversation. Even among our hominin relatives, there are clues that lethal aggression is not uniquely modern. A skull from deep prehistory may preserve blunt force trauma. Another fossil may show injuries consistent with interpersonal violence, but isolated cases are treacherous. A single blow could come from an argument, an accident, a ritual act, a predatory encounter, or something no longer imaginable. War needs more than one wound. It implies sides. It implies coordination. It implies at least some recurring sense that another group exists as a threat that must be watched, deterred, punished, or destroyed. That is why archaeologists and anthropologists are so careful with the language, and why the answer to the question in our title is never likely to be a single date circled in red. Still, some patterns are difficult to dismiss. There are places where people seem to die together violently. There are cemeteries where projectiles appear so often that chance becomes absurd. There are settlements built with defenses that seem excessive if no human enemy is expected. There are later landscapes of the Neolithic and Bronze Age where destruction layers, burned houses, and clustered trauma begin to suggest not random violence, but recurring conflict. The record is patchy. Yes, it is biased toward places where preservation is kind, excavation is possible, and later, disturbance is limited. Vast chapters of human prehistory are gone. Countless deaths left no trace at all. Wood clubs decayed. Reed arrows vanished. Flesh disappeared. Open-air killings scattered and dissolved into soil. What survives is therefore not a complete archive, but a set of stubborn remnants, enough to make certainty impossible, and denial equally hard. Modern ideas do not help as much as one might hope. For more than a century, arguments about early war have often mirrored arguments about human nature itself. One tradition imagines prehistoric people as fundamentally peaceful, living in rough but workable balance until farming, hierarchy, and property corrupt the arrangement. Another imagines them as permanently violent, trapped in small-scale competition from the beginning, with civilization merely changing the scale. Both views contain some truth, and both become misleading when treated as total explanations. Hunter-gatherers can be cooperative, adaptable, and astonishingly skilled at maintaining social ties across difficult landscapes. They can also be suspicious, defensive, and capable of lethal retaliation. Early farmers can build ritual centers, trade networks, and shared identities. They can also fortify settlements and kill neighbors. The past does not sort itself neatly into innocence, before complexity and brutality after it. Human beings appear to carry both possibilities very early, with circumstances, institutions, and memories shaping how often each one emerges. So the search for the first war leads into an uncomfortable place. It is not simply a search for violence, because violence is too old and too broad. It is a search for pattern within violence, a search for the point where death becomes organized between groups, a search for the first landscapes where people do not merely fear danger in general, but fear attack from identifiable others. And that search leads again and again to bones, broken edges, burial grounds, palisades, scars, and river valleys under pressure. It leads to the margins where climates shift, populations move, and neighbors become rivals. It leads to the strange realization that war, one of the most devastating structures humans ever create, may begin not with grand ideology, but with accumulated memory. Someone was attacked here before. Someone must watch tonight. Someone must strike first time. The oldest evidence will not let us rest in certainty. That, too, is part of the story. We are dealing with the subject where absence of proof is not proof of peace, and proof of violence is not always proof of war. Between these two cautions lies the whole haunted field of inquiry. The coming trail will move from Ice Age cemeteries to contested river corridors, from massacres in prehistoric Europe to fortified villages of early farmers, from anthropology's comparisons to archaeology's hard fragments. Along the way, scholars will argue over definitions, over motives, over whether climate or property or population pressure matters most, and over whether war is ancient because it is deeply rooted, or because certain social thresholds make it more likely to bloom. What survives in the record suggests that the answer is neither simple nor comforting. For now the mystery remains where it began, in the sand beside the river and in the silence of the dead. They do not tell us who shouted first, who fled, who returned, or whether those who buried them believed this violence was new or already familiar. They tell us only that somewhere in the human past, long before history had a name for it, people learned that other people could organize harm. That knowledge may be one of the oldest dark inheritances our species carries. The question is not whether humans were capable of it. The bones have already answered that. The question is when that capability hardened into something larger, something social, something expected. That is where the trail begins. Long before there are walls, banners, or kings with names carved into stone, there are only small human groups moving through a large and difficult world. They travel under skies without borders. They follow herds, seasons, rivers, coastlines, and memory. They sleep in places that must be judged each evening for shelter, visibility, water, and risk. They know where flint can be found, where fish run at the right time of year, where fruit ripens, where a marsh becomes impossible after rain, where strangers have been seen before. In this older human world, survival depends less on domination than on attention. To live is to notice footprints, smoke, broken branches, bird calls, weather changes, the scent of animals, the silence where there should be noise. It is a life that can look peaceful from a distance, because it leaves so little behind. But peace in prehistory is not the same as ease. Every day rests on a fragile balance of calories, cooperation, luck, and caution. That caution matters because small bands do not live in isolation, however tempting that image may be. For a long time, popular imagination treats prehistoric hunter-gatherers as tiny, self-contained units drifting through emptiness, as if the earth is vast, and human encounters are rare. In reality, many such groups are likely connected through a wider web of kinship, exchange, intermarriage, rivalry, and ritual obligation. A band may number only a few dozen people, but it belongs to a much larger social landscape. Mates come from beyond the immediate camp. Tools and raw materials can travel surprising distances through chains of contact. Stories, songs, and warnings travel too. So do grudges. The world of foragers is not a blank map. It is a mental geography of trusted places, dangerous places, remembered meetings, and other people whose intentions may never be entirely clear. This is one reason the origin of war is so elusive. The earliest humans are neither isolated innocents nor permanent combatants. They are something more complicated and more believable. They are intensely social creatures who depend on cooperation within their own group, and often beyond it. A lone human band cut off entirely from others is vulnerable in genetic, ecological, and practical terms. Exchange matters. Alliances matter. Hospitality may matter. At the same time, these same groups live close to subsistence, and even a mild disruption can make the difference between resilience and hunger. A failed season, a sick child, an injured hunter, an unexpected flood, a shifting migration route, a drying water source. All of these alter the emotional climate in which strangers are judged. The same neighboring group that last year offered marriage partners or shared access to fish may this year look like competition wearing a human face. Anthropology has long tried to use recent or historically documented hunter-gatherer societies as rough windows into this older world. Though scholars still debate how far such analogies can be trusted, no modern society is a fossil. Every community observed in recent centuries has its own history, pressures, and encounters with expanding states, markets, and colonial violence. Even so, cross-cultural studies suggest a pattern that is useful here. Small-scale societies are often highly variable. Some manage conflict through ritual, mediation, vision, or strategic movement. If tensions rise too far, people leave, camps split, disputes cool through distance. Others, under different ecological and social conditions, sustain cycles of feud, raid, and revenge that can last across generations. Neither model should be universalized. What survives in the record suggests flexibility rather than fate. Human groups can become remarkably skilled at peacekeeping when conditions allow it, and remarkably persistent in hostility when memories harden and opportunities shrink. That flexibility is easy to underestimate, because the material life of hunter-gatherers seems so light. There are no granaries to seize, no stone palaces to burn, no fields to defend in the later agricultural sense. But mobile life does not mean there is nothing worth contesting. On the contrary, some of the most important resources in a foraging world are fixed in place, or seasonally concentrated. A waterhole in arid country matters, a salmon run matters, a patch of coast rich in shellfish matters, a valley where game predictably funnels in certain months matters. So does knowledge about those places, and the social right to use them. Territory in such societies may be fluid, overlapping and negotiated, but fluid does not mean meaningless. Access can be shared, restricted, inherited, defended, or tolerated according to relationship, need, and precedent. When the pattern breaks, violence can follow. Even within a single group, there are pressures that make human violence ancient without yet making war inevitable. Young men may compete for status, families may quarrel, sexual jealousy, insult, revenge, fear, and suspicion can all escalate. Some individuals will always be more aggressive than others. Some societies channel that aggression through ritual combat, boasting, hunting prestige, or systems of compensation. Others fail to contain it. The archaeological record catches only scattered flashes of these tensions, but bodies sometimes preserve the traces: cranial trauma, parry fractures on forearms, healed injuries that suggest survival after assault. These wounds remind us that prehistoric life includes conflict at close range, face to face, where the attacker is not an abstraction, but a person standing within arm's length. That matters because war does not emerge from nowhere. Before there is organized group conflict, there must already be a human capacity for interpersonal violence, along with social rules that either restrain it or amplify it. The restraint can be as important as the violence itself. In small bands, every adult matters. To lose one skilled hunter, one knowledgeable elder, one nursing mother, one adolescent on the verge of full contribution, is costly. Open internal violence threatens the group's own survival. This creates strong incentives for peacemaking, ridicule, ostracism, intervention by kin, or simply separation. A quarrel that would destroy a small camp may be diffused because the alternative is too dangerous. That same logic can sometimes apply between groups as well. Neighbors can become enemies, but they can also become future in-laws, trading partners, or allies in hard times. A landscape dotted with small communities often rewards ambiguity. One does not always want to exterminate the people one may need next winter. This is another reason scholars hesitate to imagine constant primeval warfare. For much of prehistory, the arithmetic of survival often favors caution over annihilation. And yet, there is a shadow on the edge of that arithmetic. Small groups can absorb only so much insult and injury before restraint gives way to retaliation. In societies where honor, vengeance, or ancestral precedent carry weight, a single killing may not end with the funeral. It may become a debt. If the accused group refuses compensation, if negotiation fails, if distance does not cool the wound, then memory begins to do dangerous work. Memory stores names, places, kin lines, and the story of who struck first. Once violence is remembered collectively rather than individually, the path toward group conflict becomes more visible. It is no longer only one person against another. It is our dead against theirs. Even if such episodes remain intermittent, the social logic is changing. Past harm becomes a reason for future harm, and every new strike arrives already carrying the weight of the old one. This is where forager life reveals something deeply important about the origins of war. War does not require cities. It does not require metal. It does not require bureaucracy. It requires groups, memory, motive, and enough organization to coordinate violence beyond the individual moment. Small-scale societies are fully capable of these things. They can scout, ambush, pursue, and retaliate. They can decide collectively that danger is coming from a known direction. They can teach the young who is trusted and who is not. They can pass on grievance, but they can also avoid, negotiate, merge, or relocate. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the broad lesson is clear. Early humanity lives with both possibilities at once. Cooperation is ancient. So is hostility. Human social intelligence makes both possible, because the same abilities that allow alliance, planning, and shared identity also allow suspicion, coalition, and coordinated attack. There's also a harsher detail that's easy to miss. In a world of mobile bands, vulnerability often lies not in battle lines, but in moments of exposure. A camp at dawn, a hunting party away from the main group, women gathering plant food beyond immediate support, children and older people near a water source. Raiding in such a world does not need to look like the later clash of armies. It can be sudden, intimate, and asymmetrical. If one group believes another is weak at a certain hour or in a certain season, violence may come in the form of surprise. This makes the archaeological signature of early conflict even more difficult to interpret. One massacre does not tell us whether both sides fought. One cluster of wounds does not reveal whether the attackers risked much at all. But it does suggest that organized harm can flourish even without formal battle. The more one imagines the realities of such a life, the less useful the old contrast between peaceful nature and violent civilization becomes. Prehistoric bands do not live in a moral blankness. They make judgments, enforce norms, remember debts, and define belonging. They may live with astonishing intimacy toward the land, but that intimacy does not erase conflict. Instead, it may sharpen it, because the stakes are immediate. Food, water, shelter, kinship, reputation, access, and survival are never abstract. A modern state can survive a bad harvest through transport and storage. A small foraging community may not. A modern border may be lines on paper. A prehistoric boundary may be a river crossing remembered in stories, or a stand of trees that marks where strangers become suspicious. These are not trivial distinctions. They shape what violence means and how often it can become collective. Some scholars argue that mobile hunter-gatherer life tends overall to suppress sustained warfare because people can move away from trouble more easily than settled farmers can. Others point out that mobility can also make raiding easier and retaliation harder to control. Both observations contain truth. There is no single prehistoric template. Different environments create different incentives. Dense coasts rich in food may support larger populations and sharper competition. Harsh open landscapes may encourage distance and avoidance until a drought compresses everyone toward the same water. Forests conceal approach, plains expose it, river corridors attract movement and trap it. The conditions for conflict are ecological as much as cultural, and neither can be reduced to one simple cause. So before armies and before states, the human world is already preparing the ground. Not inevitably, not everywhere, and not all at once, but gradually through the ordinary pressures of social life. Cooperation within the group grows stronger because it must. Awareness of outsiders grows sharper because it matters. Valuable places become known. Histories of encounter accumulate. Injuries become memories. Memory becomes identity. Identity can become hostility. By the time the first unmistakable massacre sites begin to appear in the record, the human capacities behind them are already old. That is why the search for the first war cannot begin with fortresses or kings. It begins here, in the smaller world of camps, paths, seasonal returns, wary meetings, and the quiet knowledge that other humans are never just background. They may be guests, kin, rivals, or killers. And often the difference lies not in nature, but in circumstance. Somewhere in that unstable space between cooperation and fear, between remembered favor and remembered injury, the first true wars begin to take shape. Still too small for monuments, but already large enough to leave scars that outlast flesh. The change does not happen in a single moment. No one wakes one morning in prehistory and decides that what used to be feud is now war. The shift is slower, more human than that, and therefore harder to see. It lives in repetition. A killing becomes a remembered injury. A remembered injury becomes a duty. A duty becomes expectation. Soon enough, violence is no longer merely possible. It is anticipated. People begin to move through the landscape with old encounters in mind. A ravine where someone was once ambushed is no longer only a ravine. A ford where strangers appeared last dry season is no longer only a crossing. Paths acquire memory. Water sources acquire tension. Children grow up hearing not just where to find shelter, but who must be watched. That is the threshold worth following. Because war is not simply bloodshed. It is the social organization of bloodshed through time. In the beginning, the acts themselves may not look impressive from a later military point of view. There are no siege engines, no drilled formations, no formal command structure. There may not even be pitched battle in the sense later civilizations would understand it. Early warfare, if that is what it becomes, is likely intimate, local, and intermittent. It favors surprise over spectacle. One group strikes when another is exposed, a dawn raid on a camp, an ambush along a path, a revenge attack on hunters returning late. Such violence can remain small in scale while still becoming fully collective in meaning. That is the crucial distinction. A feud between two individuals becomes something else when kin join, when allies are called, when the wronged dead are claimed as belonging to all. Once people begin to kill, not just because one person is hated, but because one group is held responsible for another, the social temperature changes. Anthropologists sometimes describe this zone as the space between homicide and war. Though the boundary remains frustratingly porous, a single revenge killing may still be personal. A chain of retaliatory killings between lineages may become feud. Repeated raids between neighboring communities may begin to look unmistakably like warfare, even if no central authority directs them. Scholars still debate where the line should be drawn. Partly because the archaeological record does not preserve motive, and partly because human societies do not always respect modern categories. Violence is messy. It escalates unevenly. One generation may keep conflict ritualized or limited. The next may fail. One dry season may pass in tense coexistence. The next may break into slaughter because hunger, fear, and memory now overlap. No single explanation fully accounts for this transition, because what turns violence into war is rarely one cause. It is accumulation. Accumulation is the hidden mechanism here. An insult alone may fade. A theft alone may be compensated. A murder alone may be avenged and closed. But layer enough injuries together, or let them occur in the wrong ecological conditions, and closure becomes difficult. One side remembers an earlier attack that the other side considers settled. Another believes access to a place's ancestral right. Another sees that same access as intrusion. A marriage tie that once softened relations fails to hold because those who linked the groups are dead. A season of scarcity magnifies every suspicion. Then one more attack occurs, not in a vacuum, but atop, a sediment of unresolved grievance. At that point, violence stops being episodic and starts becoming patterned. The raid is no longer an exception. It is part of a known cycle. That cycle matters because it changes behavior long before it leaves obvious archaeological evidence. If people expect violence, they alter their routines. Camps may be placed more cautiously. Watches may be kept at night. Travel may occur in larger parties. Vulnerable members may stay closer to core settlement areas. Tools that serve for hunting may also be maintained with defense in mind. In some societies, songs, stories, or rituals may begin carrying warnings about specific enemies or dangerous zones. The first wars, if we could witness them directly, might not look like continuous combat, but like life reorganized around the possibility of attack. Fear becomes logistical. Vigilance becomes habitual. Children learn not only how to gather or hunt, but how to read danger in the behavior of others. This is one reason why archaeology often struggles to catch the beginning. The earliest true warfare may produce surprisingly little. A successful ambush leaves bodies only if the dead are not recovered. A retaliatory raid may kill 2 or 3 people and vanish into the weather. Weapons made of wood, reed, leather, and fiber decay. Open camps leave light footprints. Even when skeletons survive, they may preserve only the aftermath, not the structure behind it. We find embedded points, cranial fractures, defensive injuries, but the larger pattern has to be inferred. Was this repeated conflict? Was it one terrible event? Was it interpersonal violence within the group? Or was this the trace of a wider system of hostility? The evidence remains incomplete. Yet, the repeated appearance of similar trauma across multiple individuals and sites begins to suggest something more than random anger. There is another clue, more subtle, but perhaps more revealing. Organized conflict requires not only hatred or fear, but trust within the attacking group. To raid effectively, even on a small scale, people must coordinate movement, timing, silence, and intention. They must believe others will act with them. They must distinguish ally from enemy in the confusion of violence. This means that the roots of war are paradoxically entangled with the roots of cooperation. Humans become capable of collective violence because they are already capable of collective purpose. The same social intelligence that allows a band to hunt together, care for children, share food, and navigate alliances also allows it to plan an ambush. This is one of the most unsettling truths in the history of war. It is not the opposite of sociality. It is one of sociality's darkest applications. At first, that application may remain narrow. Raiding does not necessarily aim to occupy land in a later political sense. It may be punitive. It may be designed to kill specific rivals, seize valued items, avenge the dead, or create fear enough to alter behavior. But even limited aims can generate lasting conflict. If one group succeeds in terrifying another away from a fishing ground or a migration route, the gain is real. If a reputation for retaliation deters future theft, that too is real. Violence begins to acquire strategic value. It is no longer only an emotional act. It becomes a tool. Once that happens, the threshold into war is much nearer, because a society that understands violence as instrument as well as impulse can repeat it deliberately. Some of the earliest forms of this repetition may not even seek open confrontation. In later heroic traditions, battle is often framed as courage displayed in the open. But much early collective violence is likely opportunistic. Attack where the enemy is weak, strike when they are divided, take advantage of fatigue, darkness, terrain, weather, distraction. Such methods can seem less like war only because later cultures romanticize battle. In practical terms, however, they may represent a very old and very rational kind of warfare. Small groups cannot easily afford symmetrical combat. They fight in ways that reduce their own losses. That logic is ancient. It also helps explain why the archaeological record can feel so grimly one-sided. Massacre sites full of wounded dead may represent not evenly matched struggles, but moments when one community was caught at its most vulnerable. Once cycles of raiding and retaliation take hold, they begin to reshape identity. This is another threshold. At first, conflict may involve people known personally, neighboring camps, linked families, familiar rivals. Over time, the social category of enemy can widen. Children born after the initial grievance inherit its emotional map without having witnessed the first injury. They learn that certain people are dangerous not from experience alone, but from collective memory. The past becomes portable. It travels in story, caution, and ritualized hostility. When that happens, war begins to outlive the events that caused it. It becomes less reactive and more structural. The enemy is no longer merely the person who struck. It is the group associated with that strike, and perhaps the group associated with earlier ones too. This does not mean peace disappears. Even in deeply hostile landscapes, humans bargain, reconcile, exchange, and intermarry. Conflict systems are rarely total. Enmity may flare in one season and soften in another. Alliances shift. Families straddle all divides. The record of small-scale societies shows remarkable mixtures of violence and accommodation, which is precisely why the emergence of war resists simple storytelling. There is no clean fall from peace into blood. There are overlapping possibilities, always contingent on environment, memory, and social structure. Yet some conditions clearly make sustained conflict easier to maintain. Dense populations reduce the option of simply moving away. Repeated use of fixed resources creates predictable flashpoints. Strong group identity sharpens loyalty and blame, and each violent death, if not resolved, feeds the next. The earliest war, therefore, may not be one event at all. It may be the moment a pattern becomes self-sustaining. Not the first human killed by another human, which belongs to a much older and sadder story, but the first sequence of collective retaliations that begins to reproduce itself. A raid answered by a raid. A burial answered by another burial. A community adapting its habits because danger is now expected, not exceptional. This is harder to date than a single massacre, and more meaningful in human terms. War begins not only when people can organize violence, but when they begin to live with organized violence as a recurring feature of the world. Archaeology sometimes reveals the end point of such a process in one brutal glimpse. A cluster of bodies, weapons among the bones, injuries that suggest panic, pursuit, close assault, projectile attack. But behind that final tableau, there may have been years of smaller acts now lost to time. The massacre is visible only because preservation was unusually kind. The system that produced it may be much older. That possibility haunts every famous early site. We're not looking at the birth of war preserved in perfect clarity. We're looking at episodes from a much longer transition, one that likely began in many places independently, wherever human groups found themselves trapped between cooperation and competition. And so the threshold is crossed quietly, not with the founding of an army, but with the normalization of reprisal, not with ideology, but with memory, not with empire, but with neighbors who stop seeing each other as temporary rivals and start seeing each other as enduring threats. In that moment, the human landscape changes. The horizon is no longer just weather, game, and distance. It includes hostile intention. Someone out there remembers what happened last season. Someone out there may come again before dawn. Once that thought becomes part of ordinary life, war, however small and early in form, has already begun. The bones are where the argument becomes physical. Before that, everything is inference. One can talk about group tension, shifting territory, wounded pride, dry seasons, and the delicate machinery of retaliation, but it is only when the dead begin to appear in patterns that the older theory of conflict stops, feeling abstract. Archaeology is often slow and patient work, more accustomed to fragments than revelation. Yet there are moments when the soil gives up something too concentrated to explain away. A burial ground where body after body bears projectile trauma, a riverside site where the dead seem to have fallen in violence rather than in ceremony, a pit where men, women, and children are found together with injuries too severe, too clustered, too unevenly distributed to look like accident. These are the moments when prehistory stops seeming mute. It does not exactly speak. It points. There is peculiar intimacy to violent evidence in human remains. Fortifications, burned layers, shattered tools. These suggest danger from a certain distance. Bone is different. Bone shows where force arrived. A stone point entering a hip or shoulder, a blade mark on a skull, a fracture on the forearm that looks like the instinctive raising of an arm to block a blow. Trauma to the back suggesting flight. Trauma to the front suggesting confrontation. In some cases, healing shows that a person survives one violent episode only to live in a world where more violence remains possible. This is one of the most disturbing details in the early record. Not all ancient victims die in their first encounter. Some carry scars for months or years. They recover perhaps partially and continue in a landscape where being attacked has already become part of experience. That pattern matters because the strongest archaeological case for early war is not a single, violent death, but repeated trauma across multiple individuals. A lone skeleton with a head injury can tell many stories. A cemetery filled with bodies carrying similar wounds begins to narrow the possibilities. If many people in one burial population show signs of projectile injuries, cranial fractures, or violent death, then one is no longer dealing with mere chance. If the dead include both sexes and different ages, the picture grows darker still because it suggests not a duel or a specialized hunting accident, but a wider danger affecting whole communities. Scholars still debate how best to classify each site, and caution remains necessary. Yet, some assemblages are difficult to interpret as anything but the aftermath of repeated, interpersonal violence between groups. The evidence often comes in uneasy layers. First, there is the wound itself. Then, there is its context. Was the body buried carefully or discarded? Is the burial formal, suggesting the dead were recovered by their own people, or chaotic, suggesting sudden mass death? Are we found with the body as grave goods, or are the injuries the only signal? Are there signs of healed trauma on some individuals and fresh trauma on others, implying violence occurred more than once across the life of the community? Archaeologists must move carefully through these questions because burial practice can deceive. Bodies can be rearranged, graves can be reopened, ritual can mimic catastrophe while catastrophe can later be given ritual form. The record is never as clean as one wants. Still, sometimes the concentration of evidence begins to form a grim consistency. Consider what repeated projectile injuries really imply. Projectiles are especially telling because they create distance between attacker and victim. A blow from a club or stone may emerge in the chaos of many human situations. An arrow or spear point lodged in bone more often suggests intent that begins before physical contact. Someone aimed, someone released, someone was close enough to hit, but far enough to remain relatively safe. Where multiple skeletons show such injuries, especially in one place or population, a world of deliberate attack comes into view. Some points are stone microliths, so small they seem almost too slight to matter, until one remembers how lethal sharp stone can be when driven into flesh. Their size makes the violence seem colder, not lesser. Tiny artifacts, tiny wounds perhaps in life, and yet enough to sever vessels, pierce organs, thwart movement, or invite infection. Prehistoric killing does not need metal to be efficient. One of the stranger features of this evidence is how ordinary some victims must once have seemed before they entered the ground. Archaeology has a way of making the dead feel monumental because they carry such interpretive weight. But many of these individuals are not warriors in any later heroic sense. They are simply people who happen to stand in the radius of danger. A woman carrying trauma, a teenager struck by projectiles, a child buried among adults. Their presence is one reason massacre sites strike modern observers so forcefully. They disrupt the comforting idea that early conflict, when it happened, must have been limited to able-bodied men engaging in some mutually recognized test of force. What survives in the record suggests something less ceremonial and more frightening. In at least some cases, violence reaches into the whole settlement or camp. The Nile Valley gives some of the most famous examples, but it is not alone. Across prehistoric Europe, too, scattered sites begin to reveal bodies deposited under conditions hard to separate from collective violence. Later, Neolithic contexts will make this especially stark, with settlements or pits containing people killed in ways that suggest raids, executions, or massacres. But even before those more settled worlds fully emerge, there are hints that human groups are already capable of coordinated killing on a scale greater than individual dispute. Some sites preserve evidence of close-quarter blows, others of missile attack, others of mixed forms of trauma that imply confusion and panic. The exact meaning varies from place to place. No honest reading turns every violent assemblage into war. Yet taken together, these sites steadily erode the claim that organized intergroup violence belongs only to the age of states. There is also the matter of body position, one of archaeology's quieter forms of testimony. A carefully flexed burial with grave goods may still contain a murdered individual, but it suggests survivors had time and intention enough to honor the dead. By contrast, jumbled remains, incomplete skeletons, awkward positions, missing parts, or shallow disposal can hint at violent disruption so sudden that normalized care fails. Here too, caution is essential. Natural disturbance, scavenging animals, later human activity, and erosion can all distort what originally happened. But when poor deposition coincides with trauma and multiple victims, the cumulative picture becomes stronger. These are not just dead people. They are dead people whose death seem to have outpaced the rituals usually meant to contain death. Sometimes the most revealing clue is healing. A skull with a partially healed fracture indicates survival after assault. A forearm with an old defensive break suggests a previous violent encounter. A body buried with fresh wounds beside bones from older injuries reminds us that conflict can be chronic without leaving written memory. Communities may endure long periods in which violence ebbs and returns, each episode too small for later history to record, yet large enough to shape behavior. This is how archaeology catches a deeper rhythm. Not one catastrophe, but a background condition. People living with enough recurring danger that some of them bear the marks of old attacks, while others die in newer ones. By then, war may already exist in all but name. There is a practical challenge in reading such evidence that never quite goes away. Human bone preserves trauma selectively. Some injuries heal invisibly. Some fatal wounds strike soft tissue and leave no skeletal trace. Some bodies are never recovered. Some burials remain unexcavated. Some sites are destroyed before they can be studied at all. This means the record almost certainly undercounts violence, if anything. The most dramatic prehistoric massacre sites may not be strange exceptions, but rare moments when an ordinarily hidden pattern becomes visible because enough bodies remain together under the right conditions. Absence of mass graves cannot be read as proof that conflict was absent. The archaeological silence of prehistory is too broad and too uneven for that. The evidence remains incomplete, and yet its very incompleteness may conceal more violence than it reveals. This uncertainty cuts both ways. It would be easy and very modern to let a handful of gruesome sites darken the whole prehistoric world into an endless battlefield. That would be a mistake, even where trauma is evident. Not every death belongs to a campaign of extermination. Some societies may have experienced periodic raids, separated by long stretches of peace. Others may have ritualized certain forms of violence, Still others may have endured localized feuds that never expanded. Archaeology can reveal harm more easily than motive, and motive is what turns suffering into explanation. No single explanation fully accounts for every site. Some may reflect competition over resources, some may reflect revenge, some may involve social breakdown under climate stress, some may belong to worlds where enmity has already become inherited. The bones cannot settle these disputes by themselves, yet they do establish a threshold. They show that long before chronicles and kings, humans are already capable of killing one another in ways that are organized, repeated and communal enough to leave clusters of evidence rather than isolated anomalies. The dead in these sites are not random punctuation marks in an otherwise peaceful page. They are signs that certain human communities live close enough to danger, or inside it deeply, enough for violence to become socially patterned. In that sense, the skeletons in the sand, the mud, and the buried pits of prehistory are among the earliest archives of war, or of something so near to war that the distinction starts to lose moral comfort, and still the silence around them remains immense. We do not know what many of them called themselves. We do not know which group buried the dead and which group vanished afterward. We do not know whether the survivors moved away, retaliated, or folded the loss into ritual memory. We do not know whether one massacre ended a conflict or began one. We stand over the evidence with modern categories and patient methods, but the human moment itself is gone. All that remains are the bodies and the stubborn fact that enough people died violently, enough places to make denial harder. Each year, so the question grows sharper. If the bones show repeated group violence, then where exactly does caution end and recognition begin? At what point do we stop saying isolated conflict and start saying war? The next step in the story lies in that difficulty itself, because the ancient record does not merely provide evidence. It also resists us, reminding us that even the most brutal clues can mislead when lifted out of context. The skeletons are persuasive. They are not simple, and in prehistory, nothing important ever is. The trouble with ancient evidence begins with a very simple fact. The past is not preserved fairly. It survives by accident. Most human actions vanish almost completely. Speech disappears at once. Wood rots. Leather dries and cracks. Then goes. Fibers unravel. Flesh is lost quickly unless conditions are unusually kind. Entire camps can pass into dust with little more than a scatter of stone and ash to suggest they were ever there. Violence suffers from the same problem. A killing in open country may leave nothing recognizable after a few seasons of rain. Scavengers, trampling, and shifting soil. A body left exposed can be dispersed beyond recovery. A wound to soft tissue may never ut bone. A weapon of wood may decay into invisibility. So when archaeologists go looking for the first war, they're not searching a complete archive of human conflict. They're searching an archive broken from the beginning, biased toward unusual preservation, dense deposition, and the rare moments when many different kinds of evidence happen to survive together. That is why caution is not academic hesitation for its own sake. It is the only honest response to the condition of the material. A fractured skull can look dramatic in a museum case, but its meaning depends on context that may be fragmentary or gone. Was the fracture caused by violence from another human, or by an accident, a fall, animal damage, excavation damage, or pressure in the ground after burial? Was it healed, partly healed, or fresh at death? If it healed, the individual survived the injury, which changes the story at once. A stone point lodged in bone seems more decisive, and often it is. Yet even there, interpretation is rarely effortless. Did the point enter during battle, hunting, mishap, ritual performance, interpersonal attack, or later disturbance? Was the body moved? Was the point still in its original position? Archaeology demands patience, because the seductive clarity of violence can vanish under close inspection. Taphonomy, a word with a dry sound and enormous importance, sits at the center of this problem. It is the study of what happens to remains after death. Decomposition, weathering, scavenging, trampling, transport, burial, and all the slow distortions produced by time and environment. Teonomy is why bones sometimes crack in patterns that mimic injury. It is why skeletons can be rearranged by roots, burrowing animals, floodwater, or later burials cutting through earlier ones. It is why a body originally placed with care can later appear chaotic, and why a chaotic death assemblage can sometimes be mistaken for deliberate arrangement. In prehistoric contexts where written testimony is absent and stratigraphy can be complicated, taphonomic uncertainty is not a side issue. It is one of the main reasons scholars still debate sites that to a casual eye may look obvious. Burial practice adds another layer of difficulty. Humans are ritual creatures, and ritual can produce patterns that resemble catastrophe. A secondary burial, in which bones are gathered and re-eared after decomposition elsewhere, may create unusual clustering, missing elements, and seemingly disordered remains. Collective graves used over time may mix individuals from different moments, confusing what looked like one event into many, or many events into one. Certenary customs involve removal of skulls, repositioning of bodies, or selective inclusion of bones. Without careful excavation and dating, such practices can be mistaken for massacre, or massacre can be softened by later ritual treatment into something deceptively formal. This is one of the strangest features of the prehistoric record. Human care for the dead can blur the violence that created them, while human violence can destroy the error order, by which archaeologists might otherwise understand what happened. Then there is chronology, the quiet trap beneath nearly every bold claim. Two skeletons lying near one another are not necessarily victims of the same event. A burial ground can accumulate over generations. A pit containing multiple bodies may be a single catastrophe, repeated reuse, or some combination of both. Radiocarbon dating helps, but it is not magic. Dates often come with ranges, and those ranges may overlap broadly enough to suggest simultaneity without proving it. Contamination, reservoir effects in some environments, old wood problems in associated material, and statistical calibration all complicate the picture. The public often wants archaeology to offer a clean answer, but the truth is more granular. Sometimes scholars can say that several people died within roughly the same period. Much less often can they say all died on the same day, in the same attack, for the same reason. The problem deepens when language gets involved. Words like massacre, battle, raid, execution, feud, and war are not neutral labels. Each brings assumptions. Call a site a massacre, and one imagines helpless victims, sudden assault, communal death. Call it a battle, and one imagines opposing sides meeting in violence. Call it a burial ground of violent individuals, and the emphasis shifts toward recurring, interpersonal conflict. Call it war, and an entire structure of expectations arrives. Organized groups, sustained hostility, strategic intent, collective identities. Scholars debate these words because the labels do not merely describe evidence. They organize it. Once a site becomes famous as the earliest war cemetery or the oldest massacre, every new study has to work through the weight of that inherited framing. Sometimes the frame clarifies, sometimes it narrows what people are willing to see. There is also a strong bias toward the spectacular. Archaeology, like every human enterprise, is vulnerable to dramatic narratives. A site with dozens of violently injured individuals attracts attention in a way that a landscape of scattered caution does not. Yet war may leave its most meaningful traces, not in spectacular mass death, but in the ordinary modifications of life settlement, placed on defensible ground, repeated low-level trauma, strategic clustering, routes avoided, children socialized into vigilance. These are harder to excavate, and harder still to prove. As a result, the record tends to elevate catastrophic moments above chronic conditions. We may know more about one terrible prehistoric killing episode than about centuries of fear that never ended in a single preserved mass grave. That imbalance can mislead. It makes war seem event-like, when in human experience it is often environmental, a condition people live inside, long before archaeologists find its sharpest edge. Another difficulty lies in preservation by region. Some environments are generous to bone, others hostile. Arid zones may preserve burials for millennia. Acidic soils can erase skeletons almost completely. Waterlogged conditions may preserve organic materials exceptionally, while open, exposed sites are stripped down by weather. This means the global map of early violence is partly a map of preservation luck and research. History. A famous site in one region may dominate the debate, not because that region uniquely invented warfare, but because conditions there happen to preserve the evidence, and modern archaeologists happen to excavate it carefully. Vast portions of Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world remain underrepresented in some older discussions, not because nothing happened there, but because excavation intensity, preservation, political history, and funding have been uneven. The evidence remains incomplete, and its incompleteness is geographical as well as material. Even when bones survive beautifully, trauma analysis has limits. Not every injury can be classified with confidence. Sharp force trauma, blunt force trauma, and projectile trauma each leave different signatures, but overlap exists, especially when preservation is poor or later breakage obscures original surfaces. Some fractures happen around the time of death, others happen centuries later, under the pressure of soil. Microscopic study can help. CT scanning can help. Experimental archaeology can help. Yet a percentage of cases remain unresolved, suspended in the frustrating category of possible rather than certain. This is why serious scholars often write with maddening care, saying consistent with suggests, may indicate cannot exclude to a general audience that can sound timid. In reality, it is discipline. The ancient dead deserve accuracy more than drama. And still, for all these cautions, the record is not meaningless. This is the point sometimes lost in reaction against overstatement. Because evidence is difficult, does not mean evidence is useless. Because some trauma can be misread, does not mean all trauma is ambiguous. Because burial rituals can confuse context, does not mean every violent assemblage dissolves under scrutiny. In fact, one reason certain sites remain so important is that multiple lines of evidence converge. Bodies carry trauma. Dating suggests clustering. Context supports unusual deposition. Demographic spread includes more than a narrow category of adult male rivals. Sometimes healed injuries appear beside fresh ones, implying recurrent violence rather than isolated incident. When enough of these signals align, the interpretation becomes more robust, not perfectly certain, never that, but strong enough to reshape the broader conversation. This is where popular debates about prehistoric peace often go astray. One side points to uncertainty and declares that early war is unproven. Another points to dramatic sites and declares the matter settled. Both overreach. The wiser position is more demanding. It accepts that the archive is patchy, that interpretation must remain provisional, and that famous sites can be revised substantially with new methods. At the same time, it recognizes that repeated, communal, violent death appears often enough in the prehistoric record to make any simple story of universal peace impossible. No single explanation fully accounts for this tension, because the record itself preserves both ambiguity and severity. It tells us that organized violence almost certainly existed, but it rarely tells us exactly how often, how widespread, or in what forms it first became stable. There is a lesser-known consequence of all this uncertainty. It forces archaeologists to become historians of absence as much as of survival. They must ask not only what is present, but what kinds of violence would leave no trace at all. A clubbing that fractures only soft tissue, a raid in which bodies are removed and buried elsewhere, a camp burned lightly enough that little carbon remains, a conflict resolved through intimidation, kidnapping, or displacement rather than mass killing. Such scenarios may have shaped human societies profoundly while remaining nearly invisible in excavation. This means the first war in any strict sense may never be found as a singular archaeological object. What survives may always be later, local or partial. We may be tracing the shadow of an origin rather than the origin itself. And perhaps that is fitting. War enters human life not as a neat invention, but as a pattern emerging from social complexity, environmental pressure, and remembered injury. The evidence for such a process would almost have to be messy. One should not expect a perfect first example, waiting patiently in the ground, like the earliest wheel or the oldest known tablet. Human violence does not fossilize so politely. It flickers in and out of view, sometimes obvious, sometimes debatable, often tragic, always incomplete. So the trouble with ancient evidence is not that it fails to answer the question, it is that it answers in fragments, and fragments require judgment. That judgment can be sharpened by method, humility, and comparison, but never entirely freed from uncertainty. The bones can tell us that people suffered violent deaths. Settlements can tell us that danger was anticipated. Landscapes can tell us that fear sometimes shaped where humans lived. Yet between those clues lies a long stretch of interpretation where scholars must weigh possibilities against one another without ever hearing the voices of those who endured them. That silence is frustrating, but it is also what makes the inquiry so compelling, because if the first war cannot be found in one decisive scene, it must be reconstructed from pieces. And some of the most important pieces lie beside the Nile, where one cemetery has come to stand, the center of the whole debate. The cemetery at Jebel Saharua lies in what is now northern Sudan, near the Nile, in a landscape that has changed so much since the late Pleistocene that the dead seem to belong to another planet, as much as another age. Today the region speaks in desert colors, stone, heat, and distance. But when these people lived, the river corridor offered one of the few dependable lifelines through a broader world under climatic stress. Water, fish, birds, wild plants, and the movement of game made the Nile not just a route, but a refuge. Refuge, however, has its own danger. A refuge draws people in. It narrows movement. It concentrates need. And wherever need is concentrated in a landscape that offers only a limited number of viable choices, the possibility of conflict grows sharper. That is part of what makes Jabal Sahaba so haunting. The site does not simply preserve violent death, it preserves violence in a place where survival itself may already have been under pressure. When archaeologists first excavate the cemetery in the 1960s, they uncover something that quickly becomes famous. A burial ground dating to roughly 13,000 years ago, containing dozens of individuals, many of whom show clear signs of trauma linked to projectiles or other violence. Stone points and fragments are found in direct association with skeletons. Some bones bear cut marks or lesions consistent with injury. The sheer number of affected individuals makes the site difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Here at last seems to be one of the oldest and most compelling windows into organized human conflict. For decades, Jebel Sahaba is often described in stark terms, sometimes as the earliest known war cemetery in the world, a phrase dramatic enough to travel far beyond specialist circles. It offers exactly the sort of scene modern imagination can seize, a prehistoric Nile frontier soaked in recurrent bloodshed, where rival groups struggle over dwindling resources at the end of the last ice age. And yet the closer one looks, the more complicated the picture becomes. That complication does not weaken the site. If anything, it makes it more important, because Jabal Saharur is not valuable merely as a candidate for the First War. It is valuable as a lesson in how deep human violence can be, and how careful one must be in naming it. Later reanalysis of the cemetery, using improved methods and renewed attention to skeletal trauma, confirms that violence is indeed central to the site. More individuals than earlier recognized appear to carry lesions consistent with projectiles or other assault. Some bodies contain embedded lithic fragments. Others show old healed injuries as well as newer ones. This is one of the most striking details. The cemetery may not represent a single catastrophe in which one community is annihilated all at once. Instead, what survives in the record suggests repeated episodes of violence over time, perhaps raids, ambushes, or recurring attacks affecting the same broader population. That distinction matters. A single massacre is horrifying, but repeated violence is socially more revealing. It implies not one extraordinary disaster, but a world in which danger returns. The dead of Jebel Sahara may belong to a community, or related communities, living under conditions where attack is not unprecedented. Some survive earlier injuries, only to die later. Some appear to have been struck by multiple projectiles. The demographic spread of the cemetery broadens the meaning further. These are not only adult males falling in some specialized contest. Women are present. Children are present. This does not automatically prove indiscriminate slaughter in every case, but it does suggest that the violence affecting this group is communal, reaching beyond a narrow warrior class. That alone makes it harder to confine the site to ordinary homicide or individual feud. The Nile corridor at this time may help explain why. Around the end of the Pleistocene, climatic instability affects large parts of northeast Africa. Habitable zones contract and shift. Resources that were once more widely distributed may become concentrated in narrower, ecological refuse. Scholars still debate the precise local conditions and how directly climate stress translates into violence. But no single explanation fully accounts for the evidence without reference to environment. If groups are being funneled toward the river, if fish runs, game, or access points become more valuable because alternatives are failing elsewhere, then the social geometry of the region changes. People who might once have passed one another at greater distance now meet more often, more tensely, with less room for avoidance. The Nile becomes both sanctuary and bottleneck. That is an ancient recipe for hostility. Even so, it would be too simple to reduce Jebel Sahaba to a climate story alone. Humans do not become violent automatically because conditions worsen. Scarcity can produce sharing as well as conflict. Abundance can also produce violence when what is abundant is fixed in place and worth defending. The site becomes most persuasive when one sees environment and social memory together. Perhaps climate stress narrows the corridor of survival, but repeated attacks require more than hardship. They require decisions, fears, retaliations, and categories of belonging. Someone had to know who the danger came from. Someone had to tell others where to watch, where not to wander alone, when to move, what signs to notice. The cemetery does not preserve those conversations, but the pattern of injury hints at a social world already reorganized around recurrent threat. It is also possible that the violence reflected at Jebel Harur does not fit perfectly into any single modern label. Was it war? Many would still say yes, at least in an early form. Repeated intergroup violence, involving multiple victims over time, likely structured by competition, memory, and social identity. Others prefer more cautious terms, such as chronic conflict, recurrent raiding, or intensified interpersonal violence in a frontier zone. The disagreement is not trivial, but it can sometimes obscure the deeper point. Whatever word one chooses, Jebel Sahaba reveals that by 13,000 years ago, some human communities are already living with violence that is patented, collective, and recurrent enough to leave a cemetery marked by dozens of wounds. That is not an incidental footnote in human history. It is evidence that organized human harm reaches deep into prehistory. The wounds themselves make this difficult to sentimentalize. Tiny stone fragments in bone, lesions interpreted as projectile impact, damage to limbs and torsos, trauma on individuals who had already once survived earlier harm. There is a tendency when dealing with very ancient remains to let time make everything remote and strangely abstract. Jebel Sahaba resists that. The injuries feel immediate because the technology is simple enough to be imagined. One does not need a bronze sword or iron spear to recognize what happened. A sharpened stone launched with force will do. A human body is fragile in any age. There is no grandeur in this violence, no later state rhetoric to cloak it in duty or glory. Only impact, pain, burial, and the lingering implication that this happened often enough to become part of normal expectation. There is a lesser-known strangeness in the site as well. Because the cemetery preserves formal burial, It also hints at community persistence. These people are not simply abandoned where they fall in the open. The dead are gathered and placed in a cemetery. That means survivors remain. Survivors remember. Survivors still have enough social continuity to care of the dead, despite living in danger. This detail matters enormously. It suggests a world not of instant collapse, but of endurance under pressure. Violence has not destroyed society, it has entered society. The cemetery becomes not only a record of death, but a record of how a community absorbs repeated violent loss into ritual order. That may be one of the oldest recognizably human responses to war, to bury the dead carefully, while knowing there may soon be more. For that reason, Jebel Sahaba stands at the center of the whole inquiry, not because it gives a final answer, but because it refuses easy ones. It is too violent to support any naive vision of late prehistoric life as untroubled coexistence. It is too complex to function as a simple origin point for war. It may preserve one of the earliest clear examples of organized intergroup violence. It may also reflect a specific ecological and social crisis rather than a universal condition. Scholars still debate how representative it is, and that debate is healthy. Prehistory is not well served by coronating one site as the single birthplace of war, but neither is it well served by shrinking from what the cemetery plainly shows. By the end of the Ice Age, under conditions we only partly understand, some human beings along the Nile are dying again and again from the weapons of other human beings. And there is something else in that realization, something darker than the label itself. If Jebel Sahaba is already this old, then the social capacities behind it must be older. The planning, the fear, the group solidarity, the ability to identify enemies, the willingness to strike at a distance. None of these emerge overnight. The cemetery is a snapshot taken after the process is already underway. In that sense, it is less the beginning than the first surviving witness. The true beginnings may lie further back in undocumented raids, forgotten disputes, vanished camps, and unpreserved dead. Jebel Sahaba survives because the Nile's edge kept the record long enough for modern hands to reach it. Countless other stories did not survive. Still, one can stand mentally at that cemetery and feel the human threshold it represents. Not the invention of violence, which is far older, but the presence of violence sustained enough to mark an entire burial population. Not mere anger, but repetition. Not random cruelty, but a condition of life under threat. Along the Nile frontier, in a world of shifting climate and narrowed choices, something grim has already taken shape. Whether one calls it the earliest war or the earliest unmistakable chronic intergroup conflict, the message is the same. Humans have entered a stage where they do not simply suffer occasional violent deaths. They bury their dead inside a pattern. That pattern will not remain confined to river margins at the end of the Ice Age. As climates stabilize in some regions, populations grow and communities settle more permanently. The opportunities for both cooperation and conflict will expand. The old logic of ambush, retaliation, and remembered grievance will meet new conditions. Stored food, claimed land, defended homes, and neighbors who can no longer simply move away. If Jebel Sahaba shows a frontier under pressure, the next worlds will show what happens when pressure settles into place. Once people begin to stay put, the entire geometry of conflict changes. A mobile band can leave a place behind, even if leaving is costly. A settled community cannot do so nearly as easily, because its labor is no longer carried only in muscle, memory, and a handful of tools. It is fixed in walls, fields, stored grain, irrigation channels, animal pens, paths worn into the earth by repetition, and graves that make departure emotionally heavier as well as materially harder. This is one of the great turning points in the story of human violence. Farming does not invent conflict any more than writing invents speech, but it alters the term so radically that older patterns of hostility can deepen into something more regular, more defended, and more difficult to escape. The first farmers inherit an ancient human capacity for rivalry. What they add is permanence. That permanence begins with food. For most of human history, Wealth is difficult to accumulate in large quantities because so much of life is mobile, seasonal, and perishable. A community may have skill, knowledge, and social ties, but it cannot easily pile up months of survival in one visible place. Farming changes that grain can be harvested, processed, stored, and guarded. Animals can be enclosed and counted. Land can be cleared and improved through labor that accumulates across seasons. Suddenly, human effort begins to stay where it is put. A field does not merely feed people in the present, it carries the memory of previous work and the promise of future return. A granary is not simply food, it is delayed survival, concentrated and vulnerable. Once such stores exist, the logic of conflict expands. People can now be attacked not only for what they are carrying, but for what they have built and cannot quickly move. This is why the rise of farming matters so much in debates about the origins of war. Scholars still debate the degree to which agriculture increases violence, and the answer is not simple. Early farming communities often cooperate intensely. They must coordinate planting, harvest, water use, animal management, and shared labor. Sedentary life can support ritual centers, long-distance exchange, and new forms of social cohesion. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the recurring association between settled life and stronger archaeological signs of collective violence. The likely answer is that agriculture multiplies the number of things worth defending and worth taking. Productive land becomes valuable in a way that a temporary camp is not. Stored food creates opportunity for raiding. Population growth reduces empty space. Neighbors stop being occasional presences and become permanent facts. Permanent neighbors can be a blessing or a curse. They make trade easier, marriage networks denser, and communication more regular. They also make resentment harder to dissolve. In a world of mobile bands, a feud may cool because distance intervenes. In a world of villages, the offending group remains on the next ridge, beyond the stream, along the edge of the same valley. Their fields ripen where yours can see them. Their animals graze where your children pass. Their success becomes visible. Their weakness does too. This visibility sharpens both envy and fear. A poor harvest next door is not just misfortune, it may be a threat. A growing settlement nearby is not just proof of prosperity. It may be evidence that future claims on land will harden against your own. Settled life makes memory harder to escape, because the landscape itself becomes an archive of overlapping rights and unresolved injuries. Land, in particular, changes everything. Hunter-gatherers may defend territory, access routes, or seasonal rights, but farming often makes those claims more specific and less flexible. A field has boundaries, whether formally marked or socially understood. A terrace, an orchard, an irrigation ditch, a patch of particularly fertile soil. These become investments that tie identity to place. To lose them is to lose more than immediate calories. It is to lose labor already spent. The future imagined around that labor, and perhaps the legitimacy of one's presence. Archaeology cannot hear people arguing over boundaries, but the settled world practically guarantees that such arguments will exist once land is improved, inherited, and expected to remain under control. Conflict acquires a more durable object. One no longer fights only over access this season. One fights over continuity. Stored grain intensifies the matter further because it changes the timing of vulnerability. A foraging group is often vulnerable when food is scarce, but a farming village may be most vulnerable just after harvest, when wealth is concentrated and still visible. This creates new strategic possibilities. An attacker can seize food without needing to occupy land permanently. A raid can aim less at killing than at stripping a community's an ability to survive the winter or the dry season. Such violence does not need to resemble later conquest to be devastating. A granary burned or looted can unravel months of work in one night. Livestock driven off can destroy breeding plans built across years. Farming then does not merely increase the rewards of violence. It also increases the scale of damage a single attack can inflict. Communities begin to live with stakes that are both material and cumulative. With population growth comes another pressure. Agriculture can support more people per unit of land than mobile foraging in many environments. But this success brings compression. Valleys fill, good soils are occupied, marginal land comes into use. Disputes that might once have ended in avoidance now occur in landscapes where avoidance is less available. A village cannot simply lift itself and drift elsewhere without abandoning fields, structures, and often dead ancestors buried nearby. As a result, tensions that would once have dispersed may instead linger, negotiate, fail, and recur. What survives in the record suggests that some early farming regions become worlds of close communities, each tied to particular plots and resources, each increasingly aware that others are not going away. In such conditions, organized conflict becomes easier to sustain because proximity keeps supplying motive. This is also the stage at which inequality may begin to matter in new ways. Early farming does not produce social hierarchy everywhere all at once. But surplus creates possibilities for uneven control. Some households store more. Some lineages claim better land. Some ritual or political figures may gain influence over labor and exchange. These changes can generate tensions within communities, as well as between them. External conflict may even become a way to manage internal strains, to channel aggression outward, or to unite a settlement under perceived threat. Scholars still debate how early and how often such dynamics appear, and the evidence remains incomplete. But one pattern is clear. Once wealth can be accumulated and displayed more visibly, social relationships become more brittle. People begin to have not only different needs, but different amounts to lose. Yet, it would be a mistake to make farming sound like a simple descent into hostility. Agricultural communities also create powerful reasons not to fight. Irrigation can require coordination across settlements. Seasonal labor may be shared. Marriage alliances expand. Exchange networks move obsidian, shells, pigments, and ideas across surprisingly long distances. Ritual sites can link communities that might otherwise remain strangers. In some places, the first farmers seem to invest enormous effort in cooperation rather than fortification. This matters because it reminds us that agriculture opens multiple futures. Settled life can generate both interdependence and antagonism, often at the same time. A neighboring village may be one's rival in land disputes, and one Soratu, Telekasmolens, with Welking, Wentutho. Human conflict rarely replaces cooperation. More often, the two become entangled so tightly that one cannot understand the landscape without both. Still, the archaeological record in many later Neolithic settings begins to darken. There are villages placed in defensible positions, surrounded by ditches, palisades, or walls. There are human remains, showing blunt force trauma and projectile injury. There are sites where houses burn violently. There are pits or enclosures containing the dead in numbers and conditions difficult to explain without collective attack. These developments do not prove that every farming society is warlike. They do suggest that the settled world has crossed a threshold. The ancient possibilities of raid, ambush, retaliation, and inherited grievance are now meeting stores, property, density, and immobility. In that encounter, war becomes easier to institutionalize, not yet in the full machinery of states, but in village logic, frontier logic, and kin group logic. One begins to see the outlines of communities living not just with violence, but with defense. There is a deeper psychological change as well. To farm is to imagine the future concretely. One plants for a harvest not yet visible. One saves seed. One repairs structures for seasons ahead. One buries relatives beside land expected to remain in the family or community. All of this invests the future with place. An attack on a village is therefore more than a present injury. It is an assault on continuity. This may help explain why vengeance can become so enduring in settled worlds. The wrong is not merely that someone was killed or food stolen. The wrong is that a whole thread of expected life has been cut. Such injuries are difficult to forgive because they reach beyond the moment, into everything that was planned around it. And so the first farmers do not create war from nothing. They deepen its roots by fastening human life to fixed resources, visible surplus, and shrinking room for retreat. A raid now means more. A boundary matters more. A season of scarcity hurts more when there are fields already claimed and granaries already filled. The social consequences of attack extend further because villages are dense with memory and labor. In this world, violence becomes not only an interruption, but a threat to settlement itself. That is why the shift to agriculture is so often treated as a threshold in the long history of war. The old human capacities are still there: alliance, suspicion, revenge, fear, coordinated attack. But now, they operate in landscapes crowded with new incentives. Land can be held, grain can be stored, herds can be counted, villages can be defended, enemies can be known not just by rumor, but by the smoke of their hearths on the horizon. Once that happens, the path toward fortifications, raiding cycles, and organized communal violence grows straighter. The fields that feed people also bind them to conflict. And before long, those bindings begin to appear not only in bones, but in the shape of the settlements themselves. The first walls in human history are often spoken of with a kind of awe, as if stone or timber arising from the earth marks the beginning of civilization itself. But walls have another, older emotion built into them: fear. Not abstract fear, not a philosophical awareness of danger, but the practical fear that someone may come in the dark, cross open ground, and force entry. A ditch takes labor. A palisade takes planning. A rampart takes time that could have gone into food, tools, children, ritual, or rest. No community surrounds itself with obstacles for amusement. Even if a wall has several meanings, symbolic, social, ceremonial, the decision to make access harder is never innocent. It signals that a group has begun to think spatially about threat. Someone out there is being imagined in the design. This is one of the most powerful archaeological clues in the long argument over early war. Human remains can show that violence happened. Fortifications suggest that violence is expected. That difference is profound. A body tells us about an event, or at least its aftermath. A ditch cut around a settlement tells us about anticipation. It tells us that the possibility of attack has become important enough to reshape communal, labor, and settlement design. That may be one of the clearest signs that conflict has moved beyond isolated episodes into a more durable condition. The community is not simply reacting after the fact. It is organizing itself before the fact. In that sense, walls are among the earliest surviving fossils of strategic thought. Yet even here, certainty remains slippery. Not every wall is a fortification in the military sense. A ditch may control water, animals, waste, or movement. A boundary can mark prestige or sacred separation as much as defense. Early monumental enclosures sometimes seem too large, too oddly placed, or too lightly built to function as straightforward military works. Scholars still debate many specific sites for exactly this reason. It is dangerously easy to impose later assumptions onto earlier structures. A bank and ditch around a Neolithic site may indeed reflect fear of attack, but it may also do other things at the same time. Human architecture is rarely single-purpose. A boundary can exclude enemies, organize ritual, display unity, and define belonging all at once. No single explanation fully accounts for every enclosure, and honest interpretation has to resist the temptation of simple labels. Still, there are cases where the defensive logic becomes hard to ignore. Settlements are placed on naturally defensible promenades, hilltops or bends in rivers. Access points are narrowed. Ditches appear in configurations that make approach difficult. Palisades or walls are reinforced in ways that suggest concern with human entry rather than livestock alone. In some regions, these features cluster in periods where other signs of violence also: increased trauma on skeletons, burned structures, evidence of abandonment, mass graves. When multiple signals align, the argument strengthens. We're no longer dealing with one suggestive architectural feature in isolation. We're looking at communities whose very arrangement implies a world where threat has become structural. The emotional transformation behind this is easy to miss, because architecture can feel static. A ditch sits quietly in the soil, a palisade trench survives as a stain, a wall becomes stone on stone. But each of these forms begins as a decision made by living people under pressure. Someone has to persuade others that the labor is necessary. Someone has to say the settlement is too exposed. Someone has to remember a previous attack, or imagine a future one with enough clarity to mobilize work. Defensive architecture, in other words, is fear translated into collective agreement. That translation matters because it reveals the social depth of conflict. A raid can happen without much preparation. A fortification cannot. It requires shared recognition that danger is not random but patterned enough to build against. And building against danger changes life even when no attack comes. A settlement enclosed by ditch or wall experiences itself differently. Movement is channeled. Entrances are watched. The distinction between inside and outside becomes sharper, not only physically but mentally. Those within share protection, but protection always carries an implied contrast. The people outside, known or unknown, are the reason the barrier exists. This is how architecture begins to shape identity. One belongs to the protected space. One helps maintain it. One understands perhaps only vaguely that others do not belong in it. The wall therefore does more than stop intrusion. It helps produce an us and a them, durable enough to be walked around every day. This is especially important in the Neolithic and later prehistoric world, where settlement itself becomes a long-term statement when people invest in fixed homes, storage facilities, work areas, and burial places. Defending those things acquires a moral charge. The boundary is no longer merely around property, it is around continuity. Ancestors may lie within or nearby. Grain for the coming months may be stacked inside. Children grow up with the wall as part of the horizon. Such places are not easily abandoned, which makes defensive investment both rational and tragic. Rational because communities have much to lose. Tragic because the need to defend often signals that the option of simply moving away is fading. Walls before history are often built at the moment when people have become too rooted for old strategies of avoidance to work reliably. There is a grim irony here. The same developments that make permanent settlement desirable, stability, food storage, communal labor, ritual centrality, also create targets. A well-built village advertises value. A concentrated settlement is easier to find than a dispersed camp. Stored grain, livestock, crafted goods, even captives become potential objectives. As a result, the rise of defenses may represent not only rising fear, but rising opportunity for attackers. In earlier mobile worlds, raiding may yield uncertain returns. In village worlds, the spoils can be substantial and predictable. A wall therefore answers a new problem created by settlement itself. Human beings build places worth stealing, then begin surrounding them with obstacles. Civilization and insecurity grow together. Some sites make this relationship painfully concrete. Later prehistoric Europe, for example, offers villages and enclosures where signs of violence, defensive works, and disturbed human remains coexist in unsettling ways. One does not need to claim that every palisaded village was under constant siege to recognize a changing atmosphere. Communities increasingly treat attack as plausible enough to justify significant labor. In some cases, fortification may also carry prestige, a visible sign of collective capacity. But prestige and defense are not opposites. A powerful boundary can signal strength precisely because others are feared. That too is an old human pattern. Protection becomes performance. The wall says we are organized, we are watchful, we can resist. Such statements only make sense in a world where resistance might be tested. Scholars have also noted something subtler. Defensive landscapes extend beyond walls themselves. Paths can be designed to expose entrance. Settlements can face open approaches while shielding rear access. Houses may cluster tightly for mutual protection. Outlying activity zones can shift inward over time. Refuge sites appear on heights or islands where people may have fled during danger. A society living under recurrent threat often leaves traces not just in fortifications, but in the choreography of ordinary movement. Architecture becomes tactical. Even daily routines bend around the possibility that violence may interrupt them. What survives in the record suggests that this process is gradual. Communities do not become fortresses overnight. Instead, the environment of fear thickens step by step, and the built world thickens with it. There is also the question of whether fortifications create the very hostility they answer. Once a settlement encloses itself, it may appear more suspicious to neighbors. It may intensify boundary consciousness. It may make exchange more formal, trust more conditional, and the symbolism of exclusion more explicit. This does not mean walls cause war. Rather, they can participate in a feedback loop. Threat produces enclosure. Enclosure sharpens distinction. Distinction makes future hostility easier to imagine. In this sense, the first defensive works are not just responses to violence. They are part of the ecology of violence. One more way fear enters the material world and begins shaping the future. All of this makes the early built boundary such a revealing artifact. A weapon tells us humans can wound. A grave tells us they did. A wall tells us they expected to be wounded again. That expectation may be one of the most decisive markers of war as a social condition. It means conflict has escaped the realm of accident and entered planning. It means labor is being diverted from production into security. It means the community has begun to think of itself as a target, and perhaps as something that must remain unified under pressure. And yet the wall is never only a wall. That is the lesson archaeology keeps insisting on. Human beings embed multiple meanings in everything they build. A ditch can separate sacred from ordinary, center from margin, kin from stranger, living from dead. It can also slow attackers. A palisade can guard livestock and guard people. A gateway can regulate ritual approach and military access at once. The prehistoric world does not divide its motives neatly, and neither should we. But ambiguity is not the same as innocence. If anything, the overlap of functions tells us something deeper about early war. Once danger becomes part of ordinary life, defense ceases to be a specialized activity. It merges with settlement, ritual, identity, and memory. The boundary becomes part of being a community. So when we look at walls before history, we're not looking for the first castle or the first battlefield in miniature. We're looking for a change in human habit. People begin to build with other people in mind as threats. They shape their homes and villages against imagined intrusion. They cut ditches around their future. That act, repeated across regions and centuries, suggests a world in which organized violence is no longer rare enough to be ignored. The settlement itself has become evidence, and from there the logic keeps widening. Once a community marks itself off, protects its stores and narrows its entrances, it also clarifies who belongs, who does not, and what may have to be defended at any cost. Out of that sharpening line between inside and outside comes another development, just as important as walls. The invention of enemies not merely as immediate attackers, but as durable social categories. That perhaps is where war becomes more than defense and more than revenge. It becomes identity. An enemy is not just a person who causes harm. That would be too simple and too temporary. A true enemy, in the deeper human sense, is someone placed inside a category that outlives the immediate quarrel. Someone whose danger is assumed in advance. Someone children can be warned about before they have ever met them. This is one of the most important thresholds in the history of war, and one of the hardest to see directly in the archaeological record. Walls can survive, bones can survive, but the mental act of dividing the world into us and them leaves no fossil of its own. It must be inferred from patterns of settlement, violence, exchange, ritual, and memory. Yet once that act takes hold, it changes everything. Because war becomes easier to sustain when hostility no longer depends only on what one person has done, but on who a whole group is believed to be. That process likely begins early because human beings are extraordinarily good at sorting the social world into meaningful distinctions. kin and stranger, familiar and unfamiliar, trusted and risky, ally and rival. These are not inventions of civilization, they are ancient features of social life. Small-scale societies depend on them. A person needs to know who owes hospitality, who can be married, who shares rights to a place, who may compete for access, who can be called on in danger, and who cannot. Without such distinctions, cooperation becomes impossible. The problem is that the same mental habits that make cooperation work also make exclusion possible. Once belonging is emotionally charged, non-belonging can become dangerous. The line between solidarity and suspicion is very thin. In many human settings, it is crossed through memory. Memory here does more than preserve facts. It preserves moral arrangement. A group remembers not merely that violence happened, but that it happened to us. This is a small change in grammar and an enormous change in consequence. Injury that belongs to an individual can die with that individual or be resolved through immediate compensation. Injury that belongs to the group acquires continuity. It can be inherited. A child can grow up hearing about the people who killed an uncle or seized a fishing place or violated a boundary. That child may never have seen the original event, yet still absorb its emotional map. In this way, enemies are made durable, not by constant contact alone, but by storytelling. The past becomes transportable. It walks into the future, carried by those who were not there. This is one reason war cannot be explained only through resources. However important resources are, water, land, stored grain, migration routes, and access rights matter enormously. But material competition alone does not account for the tenacity of hostility once it becomes collective. People do not fight only over things. They fight over meanings attached to things and over identities shaped around previous conflicts. A river crossing may matter because it provides access to fish, but it may also matter because losing it would signal weakness, dishonor, or surrender of ancestral right. A settlement may attack a neighbor not because it needs immediate food, but because an old debt has not been paid, or because fear has transformed coexistence into perceived threat. Scholars still debate how much prehistoric conflict is driven by ecology versus social meaning, and the most likely answer is that the two are rarely separable. Humans do not experience scarcity or competition in a symbolic vacuum. Kinship plays a central role in this transformation. In many early societies, the group is not imagined abstractly. It is made of kin, affines, lineages, households, and those bound into comparable ties. An injury to one member therefore radiates quickly. To strike a man may be to insult his brothers, his wife's family, his children's future, and the lineage that shelters them all. Collective violence becomes possible because the self is already socially extended. This can be a force for peace, since wider kinship networks create obligations across communities. Marriage can soften boundaries. Exchange can widen the zone of familiarity. But when ties fail or are absent, kinship also sharpens retaliation. It tells people who must respond, who must be defended, and whose death cannot remain unanswered. In this sense, the invention of enemies grows out of the same social fabric that makes community possible. Ritual and belief may help harden these distinctions further. Prehistoric archaeology rarely allows confident statements about ideology in detail, but it is reasonable to suspect that rituals of burial, ancestry, land use, and communal identity shape how groups imagine themselves against others. A cemetery can be more than a place for the dead. It can anchor a claim to place. A repeated ceremony can affirm belonging. Shared symbols, ornaments, or styles can mark affinity within a landscape of difference. These things do not automatically produce war. They do, however, make group boundaries more emotionally resonant. Once people feel they inherit not only land and food rights, but sacred obligations, then defense becomes more than practical. It becomes moral. The enemy is no longer merely the one who threatens survival. The enemy threatens order itself. There is difficult tension here that has followed humans ever since. Group identity is not a flaw in human life. It is one of the foundations of care. People raise children, share food, bury the dead, and survive hardship because they belong to one another in meaningful ways. The problem is not that humans form groups. The problem is that strong groups can imagine outsiders in increasingly simplified terms. The more coherent the inside feels, the easier it becomes to flatten the outside. Nuance erodis. The strangers over the ridge are no longer several households with their own fears and divisions. They become a single dangerous category. This mental compression is one of the oldest engines of war. It reduces empathy at exactly the scale where violence becomes collective. Anthropological evidence from small-scale societies offers many examples of how these distinctions can operate without states. Groups may maintain long-running rivalries with known neighbors, punctuated by trade and intermarriage, but never fully dissolved. Raids can be justified through cycles of revenge, where each side treats itself as responding, and the other as initiating. Sometimes names for outsiders themselves carry suspicion or contempt. Sometimes ritualized avoidance or warning narratives sustain a cautious peace that can collapse under strain. These examples cannot simply be projected backward unchanged, but they do illuminate a recurring principle. Humans do not need bureaucracies or national ideologies to create durable enemies. They need memory, boundary, and a reason, whether practical or symbolic, to believe that another group's intentions are dangerous. Territory gives this belief a place to attach. Once communities are linked strongly to particular valleys, riverbanks, grazing zones, or fields, outsiders become legible not just as other people, but as people in the wrong place. Trespass, however defined, becomes moralized. One group sees movement, another sees intrusion. One sees ancestral right, another sees exclusion. What makes this especially volatile is that territory is never only land. It is also burial, labor, lineage, and expectation. To concede space may feel like conceding identity. That is why territorial conflict, once it emerges clearly, can become so stubborn. It is not purely about resources, though resources matter. It is about where a group believes itself to belong in relation to others who believe the same thing. There is also the role of fear itself, which can create enemies even before direct conflict becomes constant. A neighboring group that grows in number, fortifies a settlement or moves more frequently through contested space may be interpreted as preparing aggression even if its motives are mixed or defensive. Preemptive violence then becomes thinkable. Strike before they strike. Seize before they grow stronger. Teach them fear before they teach it to us. This logic is ancient and chillingly familiar. It turns uncertainty into justification. It allows each side to experience itself as prudent, while appearing threatening to the other. The archaeological record cannot capture such thoughts directly, but defensive architecture, repeated trauma and patterns of abandonment suggest that spirals of mutual suspicion may already be at work in many prehistoric landscapes. Once enemies are imagined as durable categories, war changes shape. It no longer depends entirely on immediate provocation. It can be planned in advance, transmitted across generations, and tied to honor, revenge, and belonging. This does not make violence constant. Human societies remain too interdependent and too pragmatic for endless war to be a stable norm everywhere. But it does make recurrent conflict easier to organize and easier to justify. One no longer needs to ask each time whether violence is acceptable. One asks only whether this is the moment to act. The moral labor has already been done by memory and identity. This helps explain why the earliest wars are so often difficult to separate from the earlier, strong group boundaries. The same processes that create stable communities, shared labor, burial grounds, defended settlements, and long-term plans also make collective hostility more durable. A village begins to think of itself as a village in relation to another village. A lineage defines itself against neighboring lineages. A people emerges, however loosely, by contrast with another people. Such contrasts may remain peaceful for long periods. They may even produce cooperation by clarifying who negotiates with whom, but under stress they can harden fast. The enemy is already half-formed in the ordinary work of identity. And that is why war can flourish even where kings are absent and states do not yet exist. The social tools required are older than government. Humans already know how to coordinate, remember, divide and defend. They already know how to transform injury into obligation and belonging into exclusion. Once those tools are assembled around recurring conflict, the enemy becomes a stable part of the landscape, no less real than a river or a hill. It may be unseen at the moment, but it is expected. People build, travel, plant and sleep with that expectation in mind. The invention of enemies, then, is not an event, but a slow sharpening of categories. It happens when strangers stop being merely unknown and become morally legible as threats. It happens when violence is remembered collectively. It happens when children inherit not only land and tools, but caution toward named others. By the time archaeology begins to show fortified villages, repeated trauma, and communal burial under violent conditions, this mental transformation is likely already well underway. The enemy has entered the social imagination. From there, the next step is both obvious and unsettling. If durable enemies can exist without states, then organized violence does not require kings, scribes, or professional armies. It can live quite comfortably in small societies among people with no bureaucracy at all. War, in that sense, is older and more intimate than later civilization often admits. It is tempting to imagine that war becomes real only when rulers appear to command it. The image is familiar: kings, standards, tribute, marching ranks, state archives full of victories and losses. Compared with that later world, violence in small societies can seem somehow preliminary, too scattered or improvised to deserve the same word. But this is one of the great distortions produced by written history. States do not create war from nothing. They inherit, enlarge, systematize, and memorialize forms of conflict that are already much older than bureaucracy. If anything, the absence of kings can make the older forms easier to miss, because there is no royal inscription to boast of them, and no permanent institution to preserve their memory. The dead remain, the burned villages remain, the defensive works remain, but the political language that later ages used to describe organized violence has not yet arrived. War exists without its later paperwork. Anthropology has long been central to this realization, though the subject is fraught and often mishandled. Researchers looking at non-state societies in different parts of the world have found not one timeless pattern but a spectrum. Some groups resolve disputes through mobility, mediation, compensation, or ritual. Others engage in raiding, ambush, cycles of revenge and organized attacks between communities. Still others shift over time, depending on ecology, trade, outside pressure, and leadership. The lesson is not that all small societies are violent, nor that all are peaceful, but that organized collective violence does not require state structures to exist. A community of modest size can still plan, scout, retaliate, and remember. It can still distinguish allies from enemies, mobilize adult members, defend settlement space, and transmit grievances across generations. These are the core social ingredients of war, and none depend on taxation or formal government. This matters because it strips away a comforting misconception. Modern people often prefer one of two stories. Either war is treated as a tragic corruption brought by civilization, inequality, and states, or it is treated as an eternal instinct operating identically at every stage of human life. Both are too simple. Small-scale societies without kings can be remarkably peaceful under some conditions, and intensely warlike under others. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for why conflict becomes chronic in one place and restrained in another. Yet, what survives in both archaeology and ethnography suggests that humans do not need centralized power to make war. They need coordination, motive, and a sufficiently strong distinction between those who belong and those who do not. In some ways, kin-based societies may even mobilize violence with particular intensity, because loyalty is immediate, personal, and difficult to refuse. The organization of such violence is often subtle. There may be no formal standing army, but there are fighting-age men who know one another, trust one another, and can move together. There may be no written chain of command, but prestige, age, experience, ritual authority, or kin seniority can guide action. There may be no barracks, but there are customs about watchkeeping, retaliation, preparation, and the obligations of response where a member of the group is harmed. This is organization in a low-infrastructure form. It can look informal from the outside, while still being socially effective. In fact, some of the most persistent small-scale conflicts work precisely because they are woven into ordinary life, rather than separated into specialized institutions. The men who raid are also the men who hunt, farm, or herd. The settlement that shelters children is the same settlement that plans defense, or without kings, is not less real for being closer to daily life. It is in some ways more intimate. Raiding is one of the clearest examples of this intimacy. In non-state settings, organized violence often favors raids over set-piece battle. Raids are efficient for communities that cannot afford heavy losses. They can be punitive, acquisitive, retaliatory, or preemptive. They exploit surprise, local knowledge, and social coordination rather than mass formation. A group may move at night, strike at dawn, target a vulnerable household or edge of settlement, kill selectively or broadly, seize goods or captives, and withdraw before effective resistance forms. To later state societies, this may look primitive or irregular. In human terms, it is simply practical. It is war adapted to the scale and risks of the society conducting it. One should not mistake the absence of parade ground order for the absence of strategy. In fact, small-scale warfare can demand a particularly refined understanding of terrain and timing. Without large logistical systems, every movement matters. Rivers, ravines, ridges, vegetation cover, seasonal water sources, animal paths, and visibility become tactical knowledge. People know when their rivals travel, when fields are most exposed, when food stores are fullest, when hunters are away from camp, when weather muffles sound, when moonlight is dangerous. This kind of conflict leaves lighter traces than the later campaigns of states, but it may be no less psychologically consuming. A community facing recurrent raids lives inside anticipation. Watches matter, dogs matter, entrance paths matter. The night itself becomes politicized. This is one reason why early war often seems more like a condition than an event. It enters sleep routine and the design of space. One of the more surprising lessons from comparative anthropology is that casualty rates in some small-scale conflicts can be proportionally very high even when absolute numbers remain small. 10 dead in a villageized society is not the same as 10 dead in a kingdom. The demographic shock is larger. The grief is denser. Skills are lost immediately. Children lose known adults, and every household feels the absence. A feud or raid cycle that in absolute terms kills dozens over time may reshape a whole social world. This helps explain why collective violence in non-state societies can be both intermittent and transformative. It does not need massive armies to leave a deep mark. It needs only enough repetition to make fear and revenge socially normal. Captives are part of this story too. Though they are harder to recover archaeologically than the dead, organized violence is not always about killing alone. It can be about taking people, especially women, children, or laborers, seizing status goods, stripping a rival community of reproductive or productive capacity, or demonstrating power. Ethnographic comparison suggests that raiding can serve multiple purposes at once: vengeance, deterrence, acquisition, and reputation. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric violence may also have involved these layered aims, even when the archaeological signature leaves only trauma and absence behind. A settlement with fewer young adults after a violent phase may tell a story that cannot be read directly. A cemetery full of deaths tells one part of war, the missing tell another. Reputation is crucial in worlds without central enforcement. A state can in principle monopolize legitimate violence, punish aggression, or impose settlements, though in practice, states often become engines of greater war. In non-state societies, the regulation of danger often depends more heavily on what neighboring groups think one is capable of. A reputation for swift retaliation may deter some attacks. A reputation for weakness may invite them. This gives violence a communicative function. Raids are not only material actions but messages. They say boundaries matter, deaths will be answered, theft carries risk, and fear can be projected outward. In this sense, war without kings can become self-reinforcing. Each act of violence is simultaneously revenge for the past and theater for the future. Leadership exists in this world, but differently. A respected fighter, elder, ritual specialist, or influential household head may coordinate response without ruling in a state sense. Authority can be situational, persuasive, and contingent rather than permanent and bureaucratic. This often makes early warfare appear fluid, but fluidity should not be confused with chaos. A society does not need ministries or written orders to know who speaks effectively in danger, who scouts well, who remembers old injuries, who must be consulted, and who can gather others to act. These are political capacities, even if they fall short of formal government. War, then, may actually help generate later political complexity by rewarding those who coordinate defense and retaliation well long before kingdoms' conflict may already be, selecting for leadership styles suited to violence. At the same time, war without kings is constrained in ways later states are not. Small communities cannot easily sustain long campaigns far from home. Their fighters are also food producers, herders, hunters, builders, and parents. Losses bite quickly. This often pushes conflict toward short, sharp forms, rather than extended occupation. It also means peace, however tense, remains valuable. Even bitter enemies may trade, intermarry, negotiate, or tolerate one another intermittently, because endless destruction is too costly. This is another reason the prehistoric record looks uneven. Organized violence may flare dramatically and then recede, only to return under new pressures. The absence of permanent military institutions can limit escalation, but it can also trap communities in chronic low-level insecurity that no one has the power to resolve definitively. Archaeology aligns with this broader picture more than older stereotypes once allowed. One sees recurring trauma, fortified settlements, signs of sudden violent death, and local destruction well before the rise of large states in many regions. None of this means every small farming village or forager community lived at war. It does mean that the capacity for organized intergroup violence, sometimes sustained across generations, belongs fully within the non-state human past. The first wars are not failed versions of later wars. They are their own thing, rooted in kinship, territory, revenge, ecology, and memory. Conducted at closer range, woven into ordinary life, and often devastating precisely because the societies involved are small. That realization changes the emotional scale of the story. Instead of seeing war as something imposed downward by rulers, one begins to see how deeply it can rise from the horizontal world of neighboring communities, from the ridge opposite your fields, from the settlement whose smoke you know, from the lineage tied to an older grievance. War in such settings is not remote policy. It is proximity turned dangerous. It is identity under pressure. It is politics without paperwork, and strategy without archives. And once these older forms are acknowledged, the later history of war looks less like a sudden invention and more like an escalation. When kings finally appear, when tribute systems emerge, when bronze weapons spread and transport improves, they do not create the human enemy from scratch. They inherit a world in which organized violence already exists, and then enlarge its reach. The old raid will become campaign, the defended village will become walled city, the remembered feud will become dynastic war, but the underlying capacities, fear, coordination, revenge, solidarity, and the ability to organize harm against other groups, are already ancient. When metal enters the story, War does not become human for the first time. It becomes scalable. That is the crucial difference. The old patterns remain visible beneath the new ones. Raids, revenge, territorial fear, the defense of settlements, the inheritance of enemies. But now they are joined by systems capable of extending violence across greater distances and binding more people into its machinery. Bronze does not simply make weapons sharper. It ties conflict to mines, trade routes, workshops, elites, and tribute. Chariots do not merely move faster. They concentrate prestige and tactical advantage in the hands of those who can command animals, craft, and training. By the time early states begin to consolidate in parts of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and beyond, the human capacity for organized violence is no longer embedded only in village memory and local feud. It is becoming administrative. This transformation is easy to exaggerate if one is seduced by the splendor of the later royal imagery. Bronze helmets, spearheads, axes, swords, and decorated vehicles create the impression of a decisive break with all that came before. In one sense, the break is real. Metal weapons are more durable, more reapable, more standardized, and often more intimidating than the mixed toolkit of stone, wood, bone, and fiber that dominates earlier ages. A community able to equip fighters with bronze tools of war possesses a different relationship to violence. Killing becomes more efficient in some contexts, but just as important, preparation becomes more specialized. Someone must mine or acquire copper. Someone must source tin, often from far away. Someone must smelt, cast, sharpen, transport, and store. The weapon now carries the labor of a network, and that network can be taxed, controlled, or monopolized. That monopoly matters because it begins to separate fighters from ordinary households in new ways. In a small village conflict, the same person may farm by day and raid by necessity. In an early state, at least some fighters can be provisioned, organized, and commanded by institutions larger than kinship alone. This does not mean standing armies appear everywhere at once, or in a fully modern form. It does mean rulers can increasingly call on dependent labor, tribute, or allied contingents to sustain campaigns beyond the scale of local self-defense. The social consequences are profound. War starts to outgrow the immediate logic of neighborhood retaliation. It can now serve taxation, conquest, prestige, dynastic ambition, and control of trade corridors. The enemy is still a human category, shaped by fear and identity. But it is also becoming an administrative problem to be counted, recorded, and exploited. The chariot symbolizes this escalation better than almost anything else, though its military use changes by region and period. In early forms, the chariot is not a tank in the modern imagination, but a prestige vehicle of speed, mobility, and shock, often tied to elite status. It requires trained animals, specialized craftsmanship, and a supporting structure rich enough to maintain both in battle or in the projection of military power. It transforms visibility. War becomes spectacle as well as force. The ruler or elite fighter is no longer merely part of a raid. He is elevated, fast-moving, publicly marked and embedded in an economy capable of sustaining technological advantage. Scholars still debate exactly how decisive chariots are in different early settings, but their broader significance is clear. They show that war is now tied not only to human aggression and social memory, but to logistical complexity and hierarchy. With states comes writing in some regions, and with writing comes a dangerous new thing, the ability of war to narrate itself in official terms. For the first time, rulers can claim victories in inscriptions, list captives, boast of city destructions, and present violence as order imposed on chaos. This alters the evidence dramatically. Earlier wars leave bones and burn settlements. Now they also leave ideology. Kings describe themselves as protectors, avengers, conquerors, or restorers of rightful rule. They justify campaigns in language of divine favor, justice, insult, rebellion, or necessity. None of this means their words are reliable. Often they are theatrical, selective, and self-serving. But they reveal a new threshold. War is no longer only something communities suffer or remember. It is something institutions explain, glorify, and normalize. That normalization changes the scale of participation. In non-state conflict, war may be intimate and local, even when brutal. In early states, ordinary people can be drawn into campaigns planned far beyond their immediate experience. Farmers feed soldiers they will never meet. Artisans produce weapons for causes they did not choose. Tributary populations may be forced to support conflicts whose origins lie in elite rivalry or geopolitical calculation. This is one of the darker developments in human history. The older village logic of defense and revenge does not disappear, but it becomes entangled with command structures capable of mobilizing strangers toward organized destruction. War, in effect, becomes less optional for the people trapped inside large systems. Bronze also changes the economics of prestige. Weapons become heirlooms, markers of status, gifts between elites, symbols of power as much as tools of killing. This encourages competitive display. A ruler who can arm followers well attracts loyalty. A chief or king associated with successful campaigns acquires wealth, captives, and legitimacy. Violence feeds hierarchy, and hierarchy in turn feeds violence, by rewarding those who can command it. No single explanation fully accounts for this feedback loop, because ideology, resource access, social competition, and inherited enmity all play their part. But the cumulative effect is unmistakable. War ceases to be only a risk of living near enemies. It becomes a means of making and maintaining unequal power. And yet beneath all this enlargement, the old forms endure. Early states do not abolish raiding, they absorb it. Campaigns often still aim at familiar goals, seizing food, animals, land, labor, and people. Villages still fortify. Frontier zones still live by watchfulness. Small communities caught between larger powers still endure the sudden violence of attack at dawn, fire in houses, flight with children, and the burial of the dead after the soldiers move on. The grand language of empire can conceal how old and local the human experience of war remains. A palace archive may record tribute from a conquered district. On the ground, that conquest may feel like the same ancient pattern in larger clothing. Strangers arriving, organized enough to overwhelm resistance, taking what they can, leaving fear behind. There is a further escalation in memory. Earlier conflict is carried in oral tradition, kin obligation, and place-based caution. States can monumentalize memory. They build steely, carved reliefs, inscribe names, and turn victory into public narrative. This has a profound psychological effect. War becomes part of political identity at the level of the state itself, not simply a response to threat, but a proof of legitimacy. A ruler who does not conquer may appear weak. A dynasty may ground its authority in successful campaigns. Subjects may be taught implicitly or explicitly that expansion is order and defeat is shame. Such ideas do not create violence from nothing, but they intensify it by embedding it in the very grammar of rule. The human body feels this escalation in blunt ways. Better weapons mean deeper wounds and different injury patterns. Larger campaigns mean more displacement, more burned fields, more seeger-like conditions, more captives marched away from home. A village destroyed in a prehistoric feud is a local tragedy. A district ravaged by an early state can become a system of recurring extraction and submission. The cost is no longer counted only in the dead buried nearby, but in labor diverted, children uprooted, fields abandoned, and whole populations made available to power. This is where war begins to cross from communal violence into something recognizably political on a much broader scale. Still, one should be careful not to let the early state monopolize the story. Bronze and chariots do not mark the beginning of war. They mark the beginning of its amplification through institutions. The same fears that once drove the first palisades now help justify garrisons and campaigns. The same inherited rivalries that once led to raid and reprisal now become matters of dynastic strategy. The same human ability to divide the world into us and them now operates through scribes, priests, storehouses, and command. Ancient war is not replaced. It is layered. The village and the palace coexist, and the logic of each can feed the other. This layered reality is why the rise of early states should feel troubling rather than triumphant. Civilization gives humans extraordinary tools for coordination, memory, engineering, law, art, and exchange. It also gives them better ways to organize harm. A surplus can feed cities or armies. Writing can record harvests or conquests. Roads can carry merchants or soldiers. The wheel can move grain or chariots. None of these technologies are war by nature, yet once violence is already part of human social life, every increase in scale creates the possibility of more expansive conflict. Progress in organization does not cancel ancient aggression. It gives it reach. So the Bronze Age and the first great state systems do not answer the question of when war begins. They answer a different question. What happens once very old human habits of organized violence are fused to hierarchy, metallurgy, and administration? The answer is escalation. War becomes more visible, more narratable, more prestigious, and often more devastating. It leaves clearer traces because states are proud enough to advertise it and durable enough to preserve those advertisements. But visibility can mislead. The royal inscription is loud, and the prehistoric grave is silent. One should not mistake loudness for origin. Long before bronze blades flash in the sun, or chariots wheel across dry ground, humans already know how to raid, bury, fortify, fear, and remember. What changes now is not the existence of war, but its capacity to spread through larger systems. And as that spread begins, a deeper question remains unresolved beneath the noise of kings and metal. Why do humans return to organized violence so often at all? Is it hunger, ambition, climate, pride, biology, fear, or something in the structure of social life itself? The next part of the story turns toward those competing explanations, because even after thousands of years, no single answer has managed to silence the others. By the time war becomes visible in graves, walls, burned settlements, royal inscriptions, and the heavy silence of abandoned places, the question has already shifted. It is no longer enough to ask when humans first fought. The harder question is why organized violence keeps returning under such different conditions. Ice Age river corridors, early farming villages, fortified hilltops, bronze-bearing kingdoms, these are not the same worlds. And yet conflict appears in all of them. That continuity has produced an argument almost as old as modern anthropology itself. Is war rooted in human evolution, a deep inheritance from competition among social primates? Is it mainly the result of material pressures such as scarce resources, population density, and ecological stress? Is it driven by status, revenge, and the social rewards attached to courage and retaliation? Or is it less a permanent instinct than a pattern that emerges when certain institutions, identities, and fears align? Scholars still debate each of these explanations, and the truth remains uncomfortable precisely because none of them can be dismissed entirely. The evolutionary argument has always had a certain harsh appeal. Humans are not the only animals that kill their own kind, nor the only social primates capable of coalitionary aggression. Chimpanzees, our close relatives, can patrol territorial boundaries, attack vulnerable neighbors, and inflict lethal violence in ways that look disturbingly organized. To some researchers, this suggests that the roots of war may lie very deep indeed, not as armies or ideologies, but as a capacity for group-based aggression built into the broader inheritance of primate social life. The appeal of this view is obvious. It seems to explain why war can appear in societies separated by immense distances and different technologies. It gives conflict a dark antiquity, making later human violence feel like elaboration rather than invention. And yet the evolutionary argument becomes misleading the moment it is asked to do too much. A capacity is not a destiny. Humans also inherit extraordinary capacities for empathy, alliance building, shared childcare, teaching, reconciliation, and cooperation with unrelated individuals on scales few animals approach. If one points to aggression in primate relatives, one must also point to care and coalition in human history itself. Biology supplies potentials, not scripts. It may help explain why organized violence is possible, why young males, in particular, may sometimes be drawn toward risky status competition, why group loyalty can become fierce under threat. But biology alone cannot explain why some human societies remain comparatively peaceful for long stretches, while others become trapped in chronic conflict. It cannot explain why walls rise in one period and not another, or why drought, abundance, prestige, and memory alter the likelihood of violence so dramatically. Evolution may prepare the stage. It does not write the whole play. Resource competition offers a more grounded and often more persuasive explanation, at least in part. People fight because something vital is scarce, or because something valuable is concentrated and defensible. Water in arid country, fish runs in a river corridor, good land in a farming valley, stored grain after harvest, metal sources, grazing rights, trade routes. The archaeological record gives this argument considerable support. Many of the environments associated with early conflict are bottlenecks, frontiers, rich patches under pressure, or zones where growing populations crowd around finite resources. Jebel Sahara by the Nile becomes legible in this light. So do later disputes among early agricultural communities. Material need matters because human beings must live somewhere and eat something, and the more predictable or irreplaceable a resource is, the more likely it becomes a focal point of fear and force. Still, scarcity alone does not satisfy. Resource stress can produce sharing, migration, alliance, and mutual aid just as surely as conflict. Human communities do not become violent automatically when conditions worsen. Some cooperate more intensely under pressure, others fracture. The difference often lies in social structure, history, and trust. A valley under drought may remain relatively stable if neighboring groups have marriage ties, traditions of mutual access, or respected means of resolving disputes. Another valley may descend into violence if old grudges exist. Identities are sharp, and no one trusts concessions to be temporary. This is why no single explanation fully accounts for war through scarcity. Resources matter, but they matter inside relationships already charged with meaning. Hunger may load the gun, but fear, memory, and identity often decide where it is pointed. Prestige and status provide another powerful lens, especially in smaller-scale societies, where formal hierarchy remains limited or unstable. Organized violence can offer a route to reputation. A successful raid may bring honor, followers, desirable marriage prospects, or influence within the group. The willingness to retaliate can protect standing. Cowardice, or what is perceived as cowardice, may damage a lineage or household. In this light, war is not only about survival or acquisition, it is also about social visibility. Men, especially young men, may be drawn into violence not simply because they hate the enemy, but because courage is rewarded and restraint may look like weakness. This explanation helps make sense of conflict that seems from the outside costly or irrational. The rewards are not always material, sometimes they are reputational, and reputation in a precarious society can itself be a form of wealth. Yet prestige, too, has limits as an explanation. It risks reducing war to masculine display, which misses the broader social systems that sustain collective violence. A raid may elevate particular individuals, but it still depends on communal memory, shared fear, and a group willing to treat injury as a collective matter. Prestige explains why some actors may be eager to fight. It does not explain why whole communities tolerate, support, or demand continued retaliation. Nor can it explain the participation of women in sustaining memory, shaping kin obligations, or preserving the narratives through which enemies are made durable. War is never merely a contest of daring individuals. It is a social field in which many people, including those who never lift a weapon, help determine whether violence continues or is contained. Climate has become one of the most discussed explanations in recent decades, and for good reason. Shifts in rainfall, temperature, seasonality, vegetation, and carrying capacity can unsettle every level of human life. Climate can push populations into new contact, reduce fallback resources, and strain systems of exchange. The end of the last ice age, episodes of drought in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, and other environmental disruptions all seem in different ways to correlate with increased instability in some regions. This does not mean climate causes war directly, as if drought itself could wield a spear. It means climate alters the conditions under which people judge risk, share resources, move through landscapes, and interpret the behavior of others. In that sense, climate often acts less as a cause than as an amplifier. It narrows options, and narrowed options make suspicion more dangerous. There is also the argument from social breakdown. Communities may turn violent not only because they are hungry or ambitious, but because the institutions that normally manage tension fail. Exchange networks weaken, elders lose authority. Ritual order no longer contains grievance. Population pressure strains inheritance systems. Outsiders enter old landscapes in unfamiliar numbers. In such moments, war can emerge from the collapse of mediation, as much as from the rise of aggression. This explanation is especially useful because it shifts attention from the dramatic moment of violence to the slow erosion of the structures that once prevented it. By the time the first attack comes, the deeper story may already have been unfolding for years. People no longer believe conflicts can be settled fairly. Once that confidence vanishes, force becomes thinkable in ways it was not before. Perhaps the most unsettling explanation is the simplest one. War persists because human beings are capable of turning almost any grievance into collective structure when identity, fear, and coordination align. Not every society does this. Not every moment permits it. But the flexibility of human social life means many different paths can lead toward the same dark destination. Scarcity can do it. Abundance can do it. When concentrated wealth invites seizure, status competition can do it. Revenge can do it. Territorial attachment can do it. Climate stress can do it indirectly. Political ambition can do it once states arise. In one region, conflict begins around river access. In another around settled fields, telos. In another around tribute or prestige, or perceived insult. The causes differ, but the mechanism becomes familiar. A group decides another group is dangerous enough, hated enough, or valuable enough to attack in an organized way. This is why scholars are often wary of grand single-cause theories, even when those theories sound elegant. Human war is too flexible for elegance. It is one of the most adaptive and therefore most disturbing behaviors in the species. It can attach itself to many motives, borrow many symbols, and survive under many economic arrangements. That adaptability may be one reason it is so old. A behavior that can be mobilized by different pressures is more likely to recur across time. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests not one origin story, but overlapping conditions under which violence becomes collective and self-sustaining. And yet saying war has many causes is not the same as saying it is inevitable. This is an important distinction. If conflict arose under every possible condition with equal force, the human past would be little more than unbroken carnage, and it is not. Archaeology shows exchange, ritual integration, long periods without obvious mass violence in some regions, and communities investing immense energy in cooperation. The same species that fortifies villages also builds ceremonial centers. The same social intelligence that plans raids also sustains trade across enormous distances. So the better conclusion is not that war is fate, but that war is a recurring possibility built into a highly social, highly strategic, highly symbolic animal. Under some conditions, that possibility remains contained. Under others, it spreads. That containment is fragile. It depends on trust, alternatives, institutions, and the ability to imagine outsiders as negotiable rather than fixed enemies. When those things weaken, the door opens. The first wars likely begin when several pressures converge at once. Valuable territory, repeated grievance, strong group identity, and enough coordination to make retaliation expected. Later societies add metal, kings, taxation, and ideology. But the deeper engine is already running. Humans fight not because one single cause drives them through all ages, but because many causes can be made to fit the same social machinery. So the search for why humans first start war ends not with one answer, but with a narrowing truth. Organized violence does not emerge from nothing, and it does not rest on one foundation alone. It grows where fear, memory, need, and belonging become mutually reinforcing. That may be less satisfying than a neat theory, but it is closer to the record and closer to human experience. The first war is not born from one motive. It is born from accumulation. And once war begins in that way, its cost is written not just in theories, but in bodies. Whatever explanation one prefers, evolutionary, ecological, social, or political, the evidence ultimately returns to the same place: the injured skeleton, the burned house, the emptied settlement, the child buried beside adults, the survivor carrying old wounds into a new attack. That is where the next part of the story must go, because causes alone can become abstract. The dead never are. The cost of early war is not recorded in tallies or treaties. It is recorded in interruption, a settlement that no longer continues, a burial ground where the pattern of injury repeats, a cluster of houses that burn and are never rebuilt, a population that vanishes from a landscape it once knew intimately. These are the quiet signatures of loss in prehistory, and they do not need written testimony to feel complete. Archaeology cannot always tell us who won. It often tells us something more human: what was broken. The first cost is the body itself. Violence leaves marks that are at once specific and universal. A fractured skull where a blow lands with enough force to end thought. A forearm split in defense. The instinctive gesture of protection frozen in bone. A projectile lodged where muscle, while carried breath and movement. These injuries are not symbols. They are physical conclusions to moments of fear, confusion, and pain. In some skeletons, there is a strange double story. Healed trauma from earlier encounters sits beside fatal wounds, survival, and death in the same body. This detail alone changes how one imagines early war. It is not always a single overwhelming catastrophe. It can be a series of encounters, each leaving its mark until one does not. Beyond the individual lies the household. In small communities, death is never distant. Every loss reshapes relationships. A missing adult alters labor, protection, childcare, knowledge. A dead hunter is not easily replaced. A lost mother is not merely mourned. Her absence changes the survival chances of those she supported. Children grow up without people who should have been there. Elders carry memories with fewer listeners. The arithmetic of loss is immediate. 10 dead in a village is not an abstraction. It is a shift in everything from food gathering to social cohesion. What survives in the record suggests that early war, even when limited in scale, could be devastating in effect because the societies involved were small enough for every death matter profoundly. There is also the cost of fear, which archaeology captures only indirectly, but which must have been pervasive in certain contexts. A fortified settlement implies not just the possibility of attack, but the expectation of it. People do not build barriers and maintain watches for rare, unimaginable threats. They do so because something has happened before or seems likely to happen again. Fear enters routine. It shapes when people travel, where they sleep, how far they stray, whom they trust. Night becomes different. The boundary between safety and danger becomes sharper. Children learn not only how to live, but how to avoid dying at the hands of other humans. This psychological environment may be one of the oldest legacies of war. Not just the memory of violence, but the anticipation of it. Displacement is another cost that rarely leaves a clean archaeological trace. When a community faces repeated attack or overwhelming force, one response is to leave. Movement is not always voluntary. It can be forced by fear, by the loss of resources, by the destruction of homes, or by the presence of a stronger group. Such movement can scatter populations, break kin networks, and place people in unfamiliar environments where survival is uncertain. The archaeological record sometimes hints at this through sudden changes in settlement, patterns, abandoned sites, or shifts in material culture. But much of displacement remains invisible. People carry their losses with them into new places, and the reasons for their movement may never be recorded in anything that survives. Captivity adds another dimension to loss. While bones can show who died, they cannot easily show who was taken. Yet ethnographic comparison and later historical record suggest that early war often involves the capture of individuals, especially women and children, for incorporation into the victors' group or for labor. This is a form of violence that reshapes communities without leaving a straightforward, skeletal signature. A village that loses members to capture experiences a different kind of absence. Those taken do not appear among the dead, yet they are gone. Their identities may be absorbed elsewhere. Their original community loses not only their labor, but their future descendants. This silent transfer of people is one of the more unsettling aspects of early conflict, because it blurs the line between destruction and assimilation. The landscape itself carries scars, though often faint. Burned layers in settlements suggest sudden destruction. Repeated rebuilding may indicate resilience under threat. In some cases, entire sites are abandoned and never reoccupied, as if something about the place has changed irreversibly. This may be due to environmental factors, but it can also reflect the aftermath of violence. A place that has witnessed repeated attack may become psychologically or strategically untenable. People move not only because they must, but because they no longer trust the ground beneath them. Such decisions rarely leave explicit traces. They must be inferred from absence, from discontinuity, from the quiet spaces where human presence once was. There is also the cost to memory itself. Early war does not only kill people, it organizes how people remember. Stories of attack, loss, and revenge become part of communal identity. They shape how the past is understood and how the future is imagined. A community that has suffered violence may carry that memory in ritual, in cautionary tales, in the naming of places, in the education of the young. This can strengthen cohesion within the group, but it can also perpetuate cycles of hostility. Memory does not always heal. Sometimes it preserves injury in a way that makes resolution difficult. This is one of the reasons war can endure across generations, even when the original causes have faded. The story remains, and the story continues to demand response. It is important to recognize that these costs are not evenly distributed. Some individuals and groups bear more of the burden than others. In many contexts, those least able to defend themselves, children, the elderly, the injured, may be among the most vulnerable. At the same time, the burden of participation often falls on those expected to fight, frequently young men, who face both the risk of death and the social pressure to engage in violence. This uneven distribution of risk and suffering is a feature of war at all scales, and it appears early in the human record. It reminds us that organized violence is not a neutral force. It creates winners and losers, survivors and victims, often in ways that are deeply structured by social roles. There is a tendency when looking at very ancient conflict to let time soften its impact. The people become distant, their suffering abstracted by millennia. But the evidence resists this. A child buried with signs of trauma is not less tragic because it happened thousands of years ago. A community disrupted by repeated attack is not less real because it left no written account. The passage of time changes our perspective, not the experience of those who live through it. One of the responsibilities of studying early war is to resist that distancing, to recognize that the human consequences are continuous, even when the contexts change. At the same time, it would be wrong to reduce early human life entirely to suffering and conflict. The same archaeological record that shows violence also shows care. Burials, even in violent contexts, often display attention to the dead. Bodies are arranged, sometimes accompanied by objects placed in ways that suggest respect and remembrance. This coexistence of violence and care is one of the most revealing aspects of human nature. People can harm one another in organized ways and still maintain deep bonds within their own communities. War does not erase humanity. It distorts and redirects it, often intensifying both solidarity and hostility at the same time. This duality complicates any simple moral narrative. Early war is not just a story of cruelty. It is a story of how social beings navigate danger, loss, and identity. The same forces that bind people together can drive them apart. The same memory that preserves care can preserve grievance. The same structures that support survival can be turned toward harm. Understanding this does not make early war less troubling. It makes it more comprehensible and therefore more relevant to the present. The cumulative cost of early war is therefore not only in the number of lives lost, which we can never fully know, but in the ways it shapes human societies. It alters settlement patterns, social structures, memory, identity, and the very expectations people carry about the world. Once organized violence becomes part of life, it leaves traces that extend beyond any single event. It becomes part of the environment, something to be managed, anticipated, and remembered. And yet, even with all this evidence of cost, the interpretation of early war remains contested. Some emphasize the violence, seeing in the record a long history of conflict that challenges any notion of a peaceful human past. Others emphasize the gaps and ambiguities, cautioning against overgeneralization, and reminding us that many societies may have experienced long periods of relative peace. Both perspectives have merit, and both are necessary.